Agora sim, uma boa tarde aí para todas e todos. Uma grande alegria recebê-los aí para o Seminário de Controles Internos e os Desafios da Gestão, né? Segunda parte agora à tarde, dando continuidade aos trabalhos do segundo Seminário Internacional de Governança Corporativa, Comércio e Consumo Sustentável, Experiências da União Europeia e do Mercosul em Perspectiva Comparada, né? Nós montamos já o dispositivo aqui, bem informalmente, para falar sobre multilateralismo e as instituições no contexto da administração e das políticas públicas, a experiência europeia. Eu tomei as vezes do nosso cerimonialista ali, né? E aí nós recebemos com muita alegria a doutora Jamile Berganamachi da Mata Diniz. Né? Ninguém consegue falar o nome dela direitinho, perdão. Também a professora titular agora, né, da Faculdade de Direito da UFMG, coordenadora do Centro de Excelência Jean Monnet, doutora em Direito Público e Direito Comunitário pela Universidade de Alacá de Henares e mestre em Direito em Instituições Políticas da União Europeia pela Universidade Camilo José Serra. Também a professora Tula, professora sênior de Direito Ambiental na Universidade da Finlândia Oriental e pesquisadora no Centro de Direito sobre Mudanças Climáticas, Energia e Meio Ambiente, e atua em temas de governança climática, participação pública e cooperação. Eu, Rodrigo, né, diretor da Escola de Contas e Capacitação, professor Pedro Aleixo, tenho aí a alegria de recebê-las, de recebê-los, e vou estar mediando este painel. Neste momento, para a apresentação do painel, o papel essencial da pesquisa sociotécnica em fatores humanos e das recomendações na aceitação, adoção, legislação e governança de IA, crítica para a segurança e automação de robôs e sistemas. Convidamos, na realidade, esse era do outro painel. Vocês viram que a gente pegar o ofício do outro não dá certo, né? Eu vou passar para a professora Jamile e aí a gente continua.
Boa tarde a todos e todas. Agradeço ao meu querido amigo, ex-aluno, tenho orgulho de falar, eu gosto sempre de falar, né? Diretor da Escola de Contas Pedro Aleixo, que é uma escola, estava explicando aqui para os nossos convidados, muito importante na construção da capacitação e no aperfeiçoamento dos servidores, né, públicos em relação ao controle de contas. Então, Rodrigo, eu quero agradecê-lo enormemente pelo apoio, também ao conselheiro presidente, doutor Durval. Eu digo sempre que o TCE é um dos nossos melhores, se não o melhor parceiro, é uma parceria que nós já temos aí mais de 10 anos, né? Temos vários estudos que estão sendo conduzidos entre o centro e o tribunal. Eu quero falar especificamente de dois, rapidamente, antes de começar a minha fala. O primeiro é o Observatório de Políticas Públicas Sustentáveis. Nesse observatório, nós fizemos agora uma primeira prospecção, vamos dizer, um primeiro experimento, medindo o cumprimento das ODS pelos municípios no que se refere à água e saneamento. É um projeto que a professora Carla, que está aqui nos acompanhando hoje, sabe, é a minha menina dos olhos. Eu tenho muito carinho por esse observatório e nós agora vamos apresentar o primeiro resultado, digamos assim, mais efetivo dessa pesquisa. A intenção é a gente continuar com todas as ODS, de forma a mostrar para os municípios a importância que nós damos aqui à proteção ambiental. O segundo, avisei o Rodrigo hoje pela manhã, mas, enfim, né, a gente, na correria, nós vamos abrir um edital, uma chamada de artigos para uma obra coletiva que vai justamente chamar Sustentabilidade e Controle das Contas Públicas. Vai ser feita em parceria entre o Tribunal e o centro, né? Terá, obviamente, o professor Dr. Rodrigo como organizador também, e nós vamos colocar esse edital na nossa página web, no nosso Instagram. Eu não sou blogueira, viu, gente? Mas é porque eu sei que a juventude hoje não vê nem, né, o website, então o nosso Instagram está sempre atualizado com as nossas atividades. Nós vamos colocar lá o edital, tá? É CEJM-UFMG, para quem não siga, eu tenho que falar aqui, senão depois os meninos puxam minha orelha. Mas vai estar lá o edital e a gente pretende lançar essa obra ainda esse ano, né, Rodrigo? Se der tudo certo. Então, para mim é uma alegria, né? Eu não poderia deixar de falar, mas nós temos outras atividades, muitas outras atividades conjuntas, e teremos, né, Rodrigo, cada vez mais, porque, como eu disse, o tribunal ele é um ponto de referência na capacitação do servidor público, especialmente a Escola de Contas do Tribunal de Contas do Estado de Minas Gerais. Então, Rodrigo, é um prazer, agradeço toda a equipe, aqui na figura da Alice, que está aí sempre nos acompanhando também, professora Carla. Quero agradecer a presença do professor Ramses. Thank you, Ramses, to participate. O professor Dolma, que também veio lá da Holanda, fala português muito bem. Professor Tula, thank you. E eu vou começar a falar aqui, eu vou falar pouco para a gente escutar mais a professora Tula, porque a professora Jamile, vocês escutam o tempo inteiro. Então, não preciso falar muito. Quando a gente fala, né, multilateralismo, gente, o pessoal mais novo não vai saber o que aconteceu no passado, né? Mas, para a gente chegar onde a gente chegou hoje, 2025, as instituições internacionais, as organizações internacionais tiveram que passar por um processo realmente muito adaptativo, vamos colocar assim, né? E aí, todo mundo fala assim, estamos na crise do multilateralismo, né? Crisis of multilateralism. Todo o tempo, né? O MC não funciona, a ONU não funciona, eu escuto muito. Para que serve a ONU? Todo mundo me pergunta, né? E eu sempre falo o seguinte, aqui em Minas nós temos um ditado muito interessante, né? Fala assim, ruim com eles, pior sem eles. Ou não? Né? Nós sabemos, e eu tenho me preocupado muito nos últimos tempos, com a importância das instituições. Porque o direito pouco se preocupa com a estrutura institucional, ele preocupa com a norma. Há pouco tempo nós começamos a trabalhar com aquilo que nós chamamos de qualidade institucional. A América Latina é um exemplo, ela adora criar instituições, o Unasul, o Mercosul, Comunidade Andina, e depois elas ficam vazias, igual a gente fala, de conteúdo. Não é? A crise é permanente e normal. Claro que agora nós estamos diante de um cenário um pouco mais complexo, né? Uma coisa, porque nós temos aí medidas unilaterais extremas adotadas pelos Estados Unidos. Nós tivemos uma palestra nesse seminário, professor Rodrigo, do professor Daniel Amin, que trabalha justamente com o agronegócio, né? E quando a gente analisa a questão, por exemplo, do tarifaço do Trump, claro que nós temos setores produtivos do nosso agro, né, vamos colocar assim, que foram afetados. Mas hoje o Brasil ele diversificou as relações. A soja, por exemplo, desde o ano de 2021, ela vem, né? Hoje o nosso maior exportador não é os Estados Unidos, é a China, é a União Europeia. E com a União Europeia, nós tivemos sempre uma relação de cooperação. Nós temos que saber aproveitar as nossas cooperações. Nós aproveitamos pouco essas cooperações, muito pouco. Nós poderíamos, professor Rodrigo, aproveitar muito mais. Não é? Então, essa crise permanente, ela também serve como uma oportunidade para que a gente possa repensar essas instituições, porque as instituições nacionais também estão em crise. Nós tivemos o Não Me Representa. Todo mundo diz que o Congresso não representa. Né? Isso é uma coisa que eu adoro falar. Já falei 1 milhão de vezes. Rodrigo, representa alguém. Não é? Por mais que você discorde. Mas eu digo a vocês, não é uma crise que vai significar necessariamente... Eu sou uma pessoa muito otimista e falei essa semana sobre isso na minha defesa de tese. Eu tenho que ser otimista, porque eu não posso olhar para vocês, jovens, e dizer para vocês que não vale a pena, porque vale. Porque vale. Porque se todos nós, né, professor Rodrigo, falamos, não, mas não funciona, não vale a pena, é assim que a gente fala, né? Realmente não vai funcionar e não vai valer a pena. Quem tem que fazer valer a pena? Somos nós. Eu falo muito para os meus alunos e para as minhas alunas, nós somos uma elite intelectual. Num país onde nós temos 30% de pobreza, poucos chegam à universidade. Hoje, no almoço, com a professora Gabriele da Itália e o professor Santiago, nós esclarecemos que a nossa universidade pública não cobra 1 centavo. Nossos alunos não pagam, nossas alunas não pagam nada. Nós não podemos deixar de mencionar aqui também a questão da sustentabilidade, porque a crise multilateral é uma crise também vinculada à sustentabilidade. E aí, professor Rodrigo, como eu disse que eu não quero demorar muito, porque eu prefiro escutar a professora Tula, eu fico muito pensativa em relação à sustentabilidade. Eu trabalho com direito ambiental, né, já faz muitos anos. E quando a gente olha para toda essa estrutura normativa das ODSs, né, ISD, toda essa perspectiva que se abre hoje, que se fala muito mais do que se falava 10, 15 anos atrás, é interessante uma coisa, por quê? Porque a ação local ela é tão mais importante que a ação internacional, especialmente quando a gente fala, por exemplo, de mudança climática. Por quê? Porque a mudança climática não é uma coisa que a Europa tem que fazer o dever de casa dela. Ou os Estados Unidos, ou o Japão, ou o Afeganistão, o Brasil, a Tailândia, não me importa, somos todos nós. E aí, professor Rodrigo, eu sempre escuto 2 questionamentos muito interessantes. Primeiro, dos países emergentes, quando eles falam, né, e eu escuto isso muito, especialmente das autoridades locais, né? Como que eu vou me preocupar com o meio ambiente se nós temos problemas aqui básicos de saneamento, se nós temos problemas básicos de acesso à educação e saúde? Professora, você está me dizendo que eu tenho que me preocupar com a questão sustentável se eu não tenho aqui condições de dar à minha população um nível básico de vida com dignidade? E eu viro para ele e dou só uma resposta. Tem uma. As ODSs também servem para auxiliar na concretização da dignidade humana. Não há um item da ODS que não se refira ao ser humano. Mesmo aqueles que falam das instituições fortes e ágeis, mesmo aqueles que falam do sistema prisional, mesmo aqueles que falam da infância, das crianças, da infância e da juventude, todos, em maior ou menor medida, têm como ponto referencial o ser humano. Não é outra pessoa. Eu brinco muito com os meus alunos, professor Rodrigo, não são alienígenas. Nós não estamos falando aqui de ODS, gente, como se fosse algo que está completamente apartado de nossa realidade, porque ele está dentro de nossa realidade. E é assim que nós temos que entender. É assim que nós temos que entender. Então, essa crítica, para mim, não procede. Primeira, né, questão que eu gostaria de chamar. E o que as organizações internacionais têm a ver com isso? A ODS nasceu onde mesmo, gente? Foi aqui em Belo Horizonte, será, Rodrigo? Não. Não. Organização das Nações Unidas. acabou. Não. Porque hoje nós não podemos dissociar o desenvolvimento local, do regional, do internacional e do global. É impossível. Essa discussão, professor Doma, que nós tivemos nos anos 80, 90, de que o comércio não tinha nada a ver com o meio ambiente, isso é coisa do passado, gente. Isso acabou, arcaico. Essa situação de que o direito internacional não tem sanção e que ele não é efetivo, por favor, nós já ultrapassamos essa linha. Nós já ultrapassamos essa linha. Então, a crise no sistema multilateral, Alice? Tem, nós temos crise o tempo inteiro. Brasil, então, nós adoramos uma crise, né, gente? Na verdade, nós somos especialistas em crise neste país. Agora mesmo nós estamos vivendo uma forte crise no Brasil, o tempo inteiro. E estamos aqui. Então, eu gosto muito de falar para a juventude que eu estou vendo aqui. Eu falo sempre, né? Estou vendo aqui as minhas alunas, eu falo com elas, ó, eu já estou saindo, eu já tentei dar minha contribuição, porque uma coisa muito importante é a gente entender que desenvolvimento sustentável, o direito ao desenvolvimento ou do desenvolvimento, toda essa questão teórica, ela é toda muito bonita também, mas nós temos que entender uma coisa, é algo muito recente. Quando a gente olha para trás, não é? Se a gente compara com as áreas clássicas do direito, por exemplo, o direito ambiental is a new generation of rights. Aqui no Brasil só chega na década de 80. Nós estamos falando aí de quê? 30, 40 anos, muito pouco. Então, eu gostaria de realmente ser breve, como eu disse, porque eu prefiro escutar a professora Tula. I prefer listen to you. E também porque nós teremos outro painel na sequência, não quero atrasá-los, né? Um painel que vai ser muito importante também sobre inteligência artificial, que eu acho que são os dois grandes desafios do sistema multilateral. Não é só o desenvolvimento sustentável, é a questão da inteligência artificial, mas isso eu deixo para o professor Philip Morgan, que chegou aqui agora, né? Que é especialista na matéria, e dizer a vocês que nessa perspectiva dessas crises e dessas alterações e dessas transformações, porque a vida, gente, a vida não é linear. Por isso que eu coloquei o título da minha tese de titularidade, do caos à desordem. Isso é um conceito físico. Até dentro do caos tem uma ordem. A gente tem que buscar essa ordem. Mas é uma ordem que tem que voltar para a gente. Não contra a gente. Não contrária ao ser humano, mas favorável ao ser humano. Então, eu não vou me estender muito, professor Rodrigo, para a gente também não atrasar muito. Quero agradecer, mais uma vez, né, a importância que o Tribunal de Contas do Estado de Minas Gerais tem, professor Rodrigo, para o centro, assim, nós não podemos sequer, vamos dizer assim, quantificar. Né? Como eu disse, é uma parceria que tem dado muito certo, né? Tem dado muitos frutos. E eu só quero realmente deixar aqui, expressar aqui a minha gratidão, porque, às vezes, a universidade ela fica um pouco isolada do processo decisório. E isso é nefasto, tanto para as instâncias decisórias quanto para a própria universidade. Nós não podemos ficar fechados dentro de uma caixinha, falando só com os nossos pares e os nossos colegas, não é? Essa interlocução com outras instâncias decisórias, ela é muito importante. Então, fica aqui o meu agradecimento, Rodrigo, né? Também ao conselheiro presidente, doutor Durval, que tivemos a honra de estar com ele hoje pela manhã, não é? Um grande abraço novamente a ele e dizer que nós temos ainda muitos estudos, né, Rodrigo, pela frente. O resultado preliminar, então, do observatório, eu acredito que em 15, 20 dias a gente consiga disponibilizar, tanto lá no centro como aqui no TCE. Vamos continuar a nossa prospecção, porque deu certo esse primeiro. Eu gosto de fazer vários experimentos, né, gente? Professora, você sabe como é, tem que validar. Então, vamos continuar, né? Aqueles que queiram participar conosco, sejam muito bem-vindas e bem-vindas, e me coloco à disposição, professor Rodrigo. Muito obrigada.
Bom, agradecemos aí a professora Jamile, né, com seu conhecimento seguro e prático aí, e uma didática simpaticíssima, né? Quem vê ela se colocar aí num cenário tão multifacetado, que é uma palavra que hoje todas as IAs, quando você pede para discorrer sobre qualquer tema, ela usa, não é à toa, né? É porque é uma palavra que hoje se coloca para as pessoas com uma atratividade muito grande, uma grande simpatia. E a professora Jamile é assim, né? Toda vez que a gente vê ela falar, a gente fica mais simpático e mais atraído pela forma com que ela coloca as coisas. Então, sem mais delongas, passar aí para a professora Tula e seguimos com o debate.
Thank you, and hello everyone also from my part. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation to join the panel. My presentation today will deal with EU's multilateralism and institutions, and especially from the environmental perspective, because that's my field of expertise. So, the outline of my short presentation is as follows. So, first we will take a short look on the founding treaties of the EU to see the legal mandate of the Union to act in environmental matters and towards third countries and engaging in this multilateralism. Next, I will say a few words about the motives of EU to be active in this field. I will also shortly address the impacts of this kind of activities and explain the main mechanisms through which the EU engages with other countries in the field of the environment. I will also present one case study to give you more concrete ideas how in practice EU engages in multilateral action in the environmental field. And finally, I have a few thoughts or questions for you all to ponder, and maybe we can discuss together those. So, if we take a look at the founding treaties of the European Union, we can see that the promotion of sustainable development is actually one of the principal objectives of the EU, along with some other key values. And this means that sustainable development is also something that the EU must contribute to in its external relations. Of course, when we think about the concept of sustainable development, it has different dimensions. The economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. And as the EU is first and foremost an economic institution or union, we must take care that the other elements of sustainability besides this economic aspect will also be present in the EU's activities. And this matter has been addressed actually in the founding treaties. As you can see there in Article 11, it is said that environmental element of sustainability has to be taken into account specifically in the EU's actions. Then, when we take a look at the specific founding treaty provisions concerning EU's environmental policy, we can first of all see different objectives of the EU's environmental policy, and there it's also visible that there are some provisions concerning the EU's actions toward third countries, and these especially concern these environmental objectives. So we can say that there is a legal mandate for the EU to be active in the environmental protection matters, also towards its relations with third countries. And this is quite important from a legal perspective, that we have this mandate in the founding treaties. So, when we think about the European Union as an actor in environmental matters, I think all of us see the EU having a leading role in this area, whether we think about the global level of environmental protection or EU's domestic legislation and policies on the environment. And there are various reasons to this state of affairs. EU is keen to have an ambitious domestic regime legislation on environmental protection. It is also keen to set a good example to other countries in this field, even acting as a kind of model or accelerator to other countries to show how they could upgrade their environmental protection legislation and measures. But it's not only about the nobleness of the EU. They also have these own interests to protect in this case. So the EU, even though it's recognized that the Union is concerned about the environment, wants to protect environmental resources and so on, but at the same time, of course, as the EU is an economic institution, it's also interested in protecting its own interests, protecting its competitiveness towards the rest of the world, and those concerns are also in the background of the EU's actions in the environmental field, and especially in its relations to third countries. We can say that the EU's environmental policy has a solid external and multilateral dimension, starting from the founding agreements and coming to the very practical level, as you can later see in my presentation. The main drivers for EU's strong position in this field mainly come from its ambitious and credible domestic legislation, and also its regulatory and market power. So these factors being present in the EU, I think it's quite natural for it to try to be a leader in this field, and also intentionally trying to influence other countries and their environmental protection measures. I have identified 3 different mechanisms through which the EU engages with third countries and is active in multilateral dealings with other countries. Firstly, we can distinguish the global level of cooperation and agreements, meaning global environmental agreements, negotiations on these agreements, and so on. The EU is an active player in these circles. Then secondly comes the domestic legislative level, where the EU has ambitious and detailed pieces of legislation in different subject areas. And then thirdly comes this non-legal, more practical element of the EU engaging with third countries through different cooperation activities, partnerships, projects, and so on. So these three different elements can help us show and understand the EU's activities in this area. And before going to explaining these different mechanisms in more detail, I would like to draw your attention to some background elements of this whole picture. So first of all, I would like to emphasize the strategic role of the EU's engagement with third countries and multilateral fora in the environmental field. So, of course, sometimes it happens that the EU's policies, legislative actions, and so on have unintentional effects on third countries. So effects that were not planned by the EU, but happen nevertheless. But more usually it's the case that the EU has clear intention when it's creating a certain policy, a certain piece of legislation, that this instrument will have some effects also beyond the union's borders. And that's important to keep in mind. Then I already mentioned the self-interests of the union in this sphere. So I think in some cases there are even like cost-benefit calculations when the EU introduces new legislative actions, just to trying to estimate what would be the impacts within the EU and beyond its borders, and then the instruments details will be crafted on that basis. So it's not a coincidence that these instruments have external effects. And then finally, the Brussels effect is a term that is widely used in this context. Maybe the audience is also familiar with this term. So basically it means that since the EU is very large and influential in many fields, its economic situation and so on, so also the effects of its environmental legislation in this case go beyond its borders and concern third countries or even multinational corporations. So we are ending up in a situation where third countries or multinational corporations voluntarily actually adopt some pieces of EU legislation. So this is the Brussels effect. So I mentioned that the global level of environmental policymaking is one of the mechanisms through which the EU engages in multilateralism. And of course, international environmental negotiations and policymaking is through multilateralism in the sense that it involves basically all countries of the world through established mechanisms, processes, institutions, and those participants have the common goal that they try to advance through these institutionalized processes. So EU is generally considered as one of the leading players in these international circles, lawmaking processes. And the EU itself likes to speak about its Team Europe approach also in this context. And this means that the EU is actually a strong bloc in these international negotiations. It represents 27 countries. It speaks with one voice in these negotiations. So you can imagine how much internal coordination needs to be done before this one voice, one position is actually formed before the negotiations begin. But once it has been formed, it is the strength of the EU in these negotiations. And this Team Europe approach actually also involves the fact that during the process where the EU prepares its position to these global negotiations, it also hears civil society views to a limited extent, but still hears. And this is something that the EU and the Commission likes to be proud of, so that they are hearing also multiple voices when preparing for these lawmaking processes. It's also important to note that the implementation of global commitments affects EU's legislation, so that when something is agreed at the global level, then the EU has to implement those provisions through its national domestic legislation. And then comes the kind of loop back to third countries that then need to take into account these implementing measures that the EU has taken. Sometimes those measures can have impacts on third countries as well. So there is kind of circle going on between the global and national level or domestic EU level. Then the second mechanism I mentioned is the EU domestic legislation that sometimes have these extraterritorial effects. These effects have different motives or elements. One of them is leveling the playing field between different countries and actors. And an example of this kind of legislative measure is the carbon border adjustment measure mechanism, so CBAM. And there the idea is to prevent carbon leakage and try to get all countries to have same price for the carbon that they have in their products. So basically the idea is that even though the EU would have more stringent requirements, that the playing field would be the same for all actors inside and outside the Union. Then a bit different approach is one that tries to impact the sustainability of activities and products from third countries. And an example of this kind of legislative measure with extraterritorial effects is the EU regulation on deforestation-free products. So there, the idea is to have an impact on how third countries produce their products and when they enter the European market. And my third example is the directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. And this actually could be said to tick both boxes that I just described. So it's on the one hand trying to level the playing field between countries to a certain extent, but at the same time this directive is also impacting sustainability of activities. So having kind of multiple objectives in this sense. Then my final example here is the management of joint resources, and especially concerning resources that are shared between countries. And the most obvious example here is water. So also the EU shares some freshwater resources with third countries, so non-member states, rivers, lakes, and so on. And the EU has its quite comprehensive water legislation established by the Water Framework Directive. And in this directive, there are provisions concerning such situations where the EU is sharing a water basin with non-member states. And there are requirements that those basins shall be managed on the basis of the provisions laid down in the directive. So in this sense, quite effectively also non-member states are subject to EU legislative provisions. Then going from legally binding legislative measures to some more flexible non-legal instruments, and this means different partnerships and projects that the EU is engaged with third countries. And here we again run into this Team Europe approach. And here the idea is a bit different from what it is at the global level and EU's activities there. Here, the Team Europe approach mainly means the fact that the EU acts in its external relations, not only as a union and with its member states, but also together with other institutions, meaning the European Investment Bank and the Bank for Reconstruction and Development, also with private companies. So a pool of different actors collecting together their resources and expertise and trying to advance key priorities in target countries through these projects. This approach is based on mutual interests. They can be dressed in different ways. They can be capacity building projects, pure investment projects, legislative capacity building projects, and so on. So there are different ways and targets for these projects. But the idea is active engagement with third countries and multilateralism. I have here a few examples. So, as you can see, there are currently more than 150 Team Europe initiatives active within the Union. They are very different kinds. For instance, the first example here is directly about capacity building for third countries to help them implement the deforestation regulation of the EU. Then there's something about transboundary water management, and also what concerns Latin America is this green transition project. And just to show you a map, the yellow lines show all the countries and regions where these Team Europe initiatives are currently being implemented. So as you can see, the geographical scope is pretty comprehensive. So I will now present to you my case study. So I'm hoping to bring to you some concrete ideas, understanding how the EU is implementing multilateralism in the field of the environment, and in this case in the field of water management and water policy. First, it needs to be recognized that water has quite strong strategic value for the EU. If water resources in third countries are not managed in a sustainable manner, it can lead to various problems that also have indirect effects on the EU. For instance, water scarcity can lead to regional tensions, conflicts, migration flows, natural disasters, and so on. So all these indirectly risk EU's well-being and interests, and that's why EU is interested in collaborating in water management questions with third countries. And this area has also strong institutional status within the EU. There are various policy documents outlining the EU's approach to cooperation, multilateralism in this area, and it could be said that the institutional status of this specific field is pretty strong. And I would also say that EU is in a pretty good position in pursuing this policy field. It has quite comprehensive domestic regulation in place, good experiences on how to realize water management and so on. So I think many third countries actually appreciate the experiences that EU is willing to share in this field. And cooperation in water management is not only happening between EU and individual countries. Of course, that's one of the key mechanisms through which the EU works, but also there is global level of interaction through global processes, institutions, agreements, and so on. And then I would like to mention here again the Water Framework Directive, because it has been, or it has become, it was adopted already the year 2000. So this directive has become a kind of prototype of good water management, and many countries have been interested in learning these good practices, borrowing some solutions to their national situations, taking this as a model for their own water management legislation. So in this sense, the EU has been exporting this legislative act, not intentionally, but this is an example how this kind of exportation, if you like, can happen spontaneously. And also in the field of water and EU and multilateralism, not only legislative actions matter, but there are many partnerships, projects, and so on, through which the EU acts with third countries. And also there are many institutions involved in this work. So it's difficult to name actually any directorate of the EU Commission that is not somehow relevant to water questions. And also at the national level in the member states, these are quite cross-cutting issues to deal with. Also, some problems may emerge from this, as you will hear soon. And lastly, I would like to mention the EU water diplomacy policy. The EU has developed different diplomatic policies. One is doing with climate and energy, but also one with water issues. And this is something quite actively developing at the moment. Of course, when we think about diplomacy, we think about like foreign policy, security policy, foreign affairs, strategic actions, and so on. But in case of water diplomacy and EU, this is a broader picture. It involves all kinds of cooperation, be it related to promotion of human rights or development projects or I don't know, agricultural activities. Really a cross-cutting issue and something that the EU is actively driving at the moment. And so I would say that water diplomacy actually collects together all EU's actions towards third countries in a new way, so that it seeks to decrease tensions between countries, try to, in a positive way, to advance good environmental management. And to end my presentation, I have a couple of thoughts or questions to you. So first of all, I wonder, and maybe also you wonder, what actually these third countries, EU non-member states, think about this kind of imposed EU environmental standards. For instance, thinking about the CBAM or deforestation regulation and so on. Is this kind of activity on the part of the EU legitimate, acceptable? Of course, the EU has the legal mandate to act like this, but then again, we can say that this is really unilateral activity. These third countries have not been involved in the process of developing this kind of legal instruments. So what is your stance on that? And then secondly, I think a practical issue when the EU is implementing this kind of multilateral action in environmental matters is how can the Union actually formulate comprehensive and coordinated policies and actions in this field, because there are so many actors active. Sometimes the member states do something independently, and then the EU has its own projects, and they may even clash in some regions, or at least the actors are not aware what the others are doing, and so on. So how could we do this better so that we could avoid any conflicts, clashes, duplicative work, and so on? This is more like an administrative question maybe, but something that the EU is actually quite concerned with at the moment. So, thank you for your attention.
Agradecemos aí a professora Tula e passamos novamente à professora Jamile.
Thank you, Professor Tula. Não sei se alguém quer fazer uma brevíssima pergunta, que nós já temos aqui agora o próximo painel. A professora Tula nos fez algumas provocações, some remarks about the unilateral actions from EU. E tenho aqui vários estudantes e estudantes que falam sobre esse assunto. Então, se alguém quiser fazer alguma pergunta, aproveitem um momento. professora Tula vai ficar conosco durante 10 dias aqui em Belo Horizonte. Nós teremos a oportunidade de fazer outras atividades também, né? Mas eu acho que, Rodrigo, o que ficou muito claro aqui para a gente é o papel da União Europeia no que nós falamos nessa liderança. Não é uma questão de liderança homogênea, mas liderança de impulsionar, né, uma agenda mais sustentável, né? E todo mundo acha que quando tem um projeto de harmonia nós temos que defender a Europa. Nós temos a Europa, ela é muito atenta à questão da liberdade de cátedra. Então nós podemos fazer críticas à Europa, some critical issues, mas a gente também tem que reconhecer esse impulso que a União Europeia, né, nos dá para seguir adiante. Então, eu penso, né, e lá no centro nós temos discutido isso muito junto com o professor Márcio, junto com a professora Carla, sobre o papel mesmo da União Europeia e sua relação com o Brasil e o Mercosul, né? Então, eu acho que o que a professora Tula coloca aqui de uma forma muito clara é que esse papel de liderança da Europa, ela inclusive se estende na cooperação, professor Rodrigo. A professora Tula botou vários programas de cooperação com a África, Green Transition with Latin America, que está dentro do que nós falamos a CELAC, não é? Que a CELAC é o conjunto da reunião da Cumbre Euro-Latino-Americana entre os países da América Latina e da Europa. Então, como vocês puderam ver, a Europa tem toda uma agenda, não é, voltada para as questões do desenvolvimento sustentável, e a professora Tula trouxe aqui um exemplo muito bom, que é a questão da água, não é? Então, tem uma pergunta ali.
So, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the lecture. It was excellent. My question is, like you said, with the Brussels effects, a lot of countries who have the same legal basis, taking into consideration trades, commercial topics, and sustainability, and etc. In cases of eventual disputes and disagreements between the countries, is there the possibility of the creation of an international court to solve these problems, or no? This is my question. Thank you.
So, would you think about like an international court to solve this kind of environmental problems or disputes specifically? A new court to solve this kind of environmental disputes? Yes, that's a good question, and it's actually not a new question, because already in 1990s there were attempts to create a new environmental world court, but it never flied, so to speak. And I think the reasons back then were that mainly the disputes were so few in number that it would be a waste of resources to have a specific court for that purpose. And then also, if we think about these ordinary courts, they are free to use experts when they are deliberating their decisions, and so it is not maybe necessary to have new expert courts in that sense. But we will see, because now generally litigation in environmental matters at the transnational level has been increasing quite rapidly. We have many, especially climate-related litigation cases. Some of those are dealt at the domestic level of countries, but also international courts on human rights, and even the International Court of Justice have been dealing with these kind of questions. And I know that some experts are trying to wake up this call again for an international court for environmental matters, but personally I don't see that as a realistic option, at least for the foreseeable future. But thank you for the good question.
Thank you.
I totally agree with what Tula said in reply to the question, a very interesting question. Just like to add, as you might know, that the International Court of Justice in The Hague, my city, had a chamber which was erected to deal with environmental international court cases. And alas, it was never used. So the countries all wanted to have the full court or the normal court to deal with their issues. We have had several environmental issues at the court, and recently, of course, we had the court giving an advisory opinion on climate change. Very interesting to take notice of. But yeah, it didn't work at the International Court to have a chamber devoted to environmental case law only. That was just my addition. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Doma, for accomplished Professor Tula. Você quer fazer uma pergunta?
Não, eu sou do cerimonial.
Tá bom. Então, eu acho que ficou muito interessante, né, a complementação que o professor Doma fez. Temos aqui também a presença do professor Ramses Wessel. Thank you, Ramses, for supporting me and the partnership with Groningen University. Agradeço muito a todas e todas. Em seguida, nós teremos um painel agora, né, com o professor Philip Morgan, que está aqui nos acompanhando. Lucas Magno, nosso ex-aluno querido, hoje defensor, agora que eu vi aí. Parece que o professor Márcio também. A professora Mariá, né? E agradeço a todos e todas, mais uma vez aqui na figura do nosso queridíssimo Rodrigo Marzano. Né? Eu, quando olho assim, gente, para um ex-aluno, eu não consigo deixar de pensar que é meu aluno ainda. Vocês veem a idade que eu já estou, né? Porque, assim, muitos alunos e alunas nessa sala. Eu fico muito, muito agradecida, realmente, ao Tribunal de Contas do Estado de Minas Gerais, ao conselheiro-presidente, professor doutor Durval, né, pelo apoio às nossas atividades, e ficam novamente convidados e convidadas a participarem do Centro de Excelência CEJM-UFMG, porque eu digo que é um projeto que não é da professora Jamile, nem da professora Carla, nem do Rodrigo, que participa conosco, mas de todas e todas. Muito obrigada. Thank you, professor Tula.
Agradecemos às professoras Tula Ronconey e à professora Jamile Bergamaschini pelas apresentações e ao professor Rodrigo Marzano pela mediação desse debate. Faremos agora um intervalo de 5 minutos e retornaremos com a palestra de encerramento do seminário.
Que é o fim do corredor, nós temos banheiro, água, nós temos 5 minutos aí, porque vamos montar o cenário.
Neste momento, para a apresentação do painel de encerramento, o papel essencial da pesquisa sociotécnica em fatores humanos e das recomendações na aceitação, adoção, legislação e governança de IA crítica para a segurança, automação, robôs e sistemas ciberfísicos, convidamos ao palco o professor Fabrício Polido, para mediar os debates, chamamos o defensor público do Estado do Paraná, Lucas Porto. A doutora Maria Brochado. Lucas Porto é defensor público no Paraná e doutor em Direito pela UFMG, pesquisador na Cátedra Filotec, com expertise em regulação do design digital e interação humano-computador. Já a doutora Maria Brochado é professora titular de Filosofia da Tecnologia e do Direito na UFMG, coordenadora da Cátedra Filotec e diretora de Direitos Humanos do IDEA-MG, e pesquisadora em Filosofia da Tecnologia e Regulação Digital. Convidamos também para compor esse painel o professor Philip Morgan. Philip Morgan é professor catedrático de Fatores Humanos na Universidade de Cardiff, diretor do RUFEX e líder em projetos de segurança cibernética centrada no ser humano, financiados pela Airbus. E convidamos também a representante do Consulado do Reino Unido em Minas Gerais, Laura Queiroz. Com a palavra, o mediador do debate, Lucas Porto.
Boa tarde a todo mundo. É uma honra muito grande estar aqui mediando esse debate e recebendo vocês aqui. It's an honor to welcome you here, Professor. We hope we have a very prolific discussion, and we're eager to hear what you about to tell us.
So shall I make a start? Thank you. Is it okay if I stand? Yeah, I might stand. I can stand up there. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, I like to move around a lot. Thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful seminar. It's an absolute privilege. And I speak on behalf of all of Cardiff University in Wales in the UK for this honour as well. Thanks to Maria for the invite and for coming to Cardiff maybe 4 or 5 months ago and making this possible, and to everybody else who's been involved in this. So I'm a fan of a very short title of a talk, as you can tell. So I'm going to talk about the essential role of socio-technical human factors research for the potential acceptance, adoption, legislation, and governance of safety-critical artificial intelligence, automation, and cyber-physical systems. So a lot to get through, but I promise we'll get through it in about 40 minutes or so. That's the plan. So in terms of an overview, I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself and the university that I come from. And then I'm going to talk about technology acceptance and whether we're heading for a catastrophe with the way things are being developed at such a rapid pace without always having human end users in mind. And I'm going to talk about some mistakes that we've tended to make for the last 40, 50 years and whether we will ever learn when it comes to the next generation AI revolution. I'm going to talk about barriers and enablers to, and you can fill in the blanks there, to trust in technology. So defining trust, measuring trust, understanding trust when we get results from experiments. I'm going to use a case study which spans about 12 years of my research to date. It's not the only thing I do. But I'm going to be talking about autonomous vehicles as a safety critical use case, so driverless cars. And in particular, how we develop trust in this sort of relatively new technology, and also blame when things go wrong, because things will go wrong. They're already going wrong in some respects, and what happens to the technology. I'm briefly going to summarize a theoretical framework that with collaborators in Japan, in the universities of Tokyo, Osaka, Doshisha, and Kyoto, we've come up with a new pragmatic framework and theoretical underpinning for the design of next generation AI, autonomous systems, robots, and so on. I may have some time to briefly mention some work I'm doing on artificial intelligence with a large funded hub in the UK. And there is going to be a bit of a cybersecurity theme throughout the talk as well. And there'll be some key takeaways. So this is me. That's not my house. That's Cardiff University main building in the UK. I did try and say that was my house once in a conference, and I think many people believed me and thought that I was very rich. I'm an academic. I'm not very rich. But yeah, that's the Cardiff University main building from sort of the 1850s, 1860s. So I'm a senior professor in human factors and cognitive science at Cardiff University. And it's where I did my PhD, my undergraduate, and so on. But I have been to other universities in between, but I went back. I've got various leadership roles. So I lead human factors research for the entire university. So that's human interaction with machines and things and technology. I'm also director of research for a large center in artificial intelligence, robotics, and human machine systems. And there's over 100 people in this center: computer scientists, engineers, psychologists, legal academics, and so on. I lead various other things, human-centered design themes for projects. I'm a distinguished visiting fellow in the University of Canberra in Australia, and a visiting professor in Luleå University of Technology in northern Sweden. I also spend a lot of time working with the large aerospace giant Airbus. So they make planes, helicopters, satellites. They do a lot of cybersecurity work. And at Cardiff University, I lead a strategic partnership between Airbus and Cardiff University, largely focused on cybersecurity and human-centered cybersecurity. So us as humans interacting with machines and why we're cyber vulnerable and what we can do about it. I also have my own company when I've got a bit of spare time on my hands, which is called Humanify, where we look at all sorts of things to do with AI assurance, ethics, responsible design, secure by design, and so on. My areas that I span a lot of different areas, so AI, automation, defense, security, human-machine interface design, trust, adaptive cognition, and so on. And I've been very lucky to win quite a lot of grant applications, grant funding. So I've had 53 projects funded over the last 20 years, which amounts to about £40 million worth of funding within the UK, from all the major research councils, from industry, and also from overseas as well. So we don't do very well in Cardiff University at advertising ourselves. So I try and put a slide into every talk to tell people what Cardiff University is about and what the School of Psychology is about. So Cardiff University is in the capital city. Oh, here. Seems to be when I move. Is in the capital Cardiff within Wales, and it's a very, very large university. It does very well in terms of research rankings in the world and in the UK, so we're very, very high. We're part of the Russell Group, which is a prestigious group of universities in the UK, research-intensive universities. And very few people know this, and I don't really know why we say it. So in Cardiff, just to put it in perspective, Cardiff Psychology, in 2014, when we were ranked in terms of our research excellence, Cardiff University ranked second in the UK. So it was Oxford, Cardiff, Cambridge in that order. So we do very, very well when it comes to research. But one of the reasons we do really well is because we've got so many staff and so many facilities and so many brilliant PhD students. We have over 150 academic staff. We have over 1,000 undergraduate students. And at any one time, we have over 100 PhD students. And we get quite a lot of funding as well. We've got lots of different areas spanning, we call it from synapse to society. So everything from brain imaging to environmental psychology, climate change, and so on. But I sit within the cognitive science and human factors group. And very few people in the world know this, and I only realized this about 20 years ago. But the term ergonomics, which is a large part of human factors, so the design of things like chairs, tables, ergonomics, was actually coined in Cardiff University psychology by somebody called Professor Howell Murrell, who was one of 4 academics in psychology in 1965 when it all started. So I've had the honor and privilege of taking over the human factors research group within the university. So it's, you know, following in the footsteps of giants, so to speak. So I lead 2 different research groups. These are the main research groups, the Human Factors Excellence Research Group, where we research things like augmented and assistive systems, cyber psychology, defense and security, transportation systems, and so on. And the pictures on the bottom there, these are not staff in psychology. These are some of our PhD students. They deserve more recognition than my colleagues because they do lots of the hard work. And one of the things I wanted to highlight there, you can see some of the images, you know, of very, very great people, but some are in military uniforms. So, for example, that's Wing Commander Arwin Sands. He's doing a PhD on barriers and enablers to the use of artificial intelligence in the Royal Air Force. He looks after the King's Guard. So he looks after the Air Force for the entire royal family in the UK and the flying in and out of diplomats. He looks after the Red Arrows, for example. Then we have Eric Kambarian, who is from the state of Illinois, and he looks after fire safety for 1,256 fire stations in the state of Illinois. And he does a PhD on decision-making under pressure in highly pressurized fire situations. We've got cybersecurity experts, we've got police officers, and then we've got people who come from degrees and masters level. So a very, very diverse range of people, and they're brilliant to work with. We then have the Center for Artificial Intelligence, Robotics and Human Machine Systems, where our 4 core themes are human-like AI, humans and robots, ethical and explainable artificial intelligence, and human-centered technology in society. This is just one of our research laboratories. So we were lucky enough to get funding from the European Regional Development Fund, ERDF, about 5 years ago in collaboration with Cardiff University. And in the School of Psychology at Cardiff, we built a very, I think, impressive simulation laboratory where we have, for example, a 6-meter immersive virtual reality dome with a full ambisonic sound system where we can simulate military environments, we can simulate being inside an aircraft and so on. We have a command and control center, which triples up as a traffic control center, an environmental control center, and so on. We have a large-scale driving simulator that does fully autonomous driving. We have robots in the lab, social robots, industrial robots. So it's a great place to do research. We like collecting lots of data. So that's the introduction. So on to the next part of the talk. Does anybody recognize where this is? It's not Cardiff in Wales. It may say it on the top of the slide. Oh, no, it does. Sorry. Yeah. I should read the titles of my slides. So this is San Francisco in the US in July 2023. So I was there on a conference. And I knew this, that there were autonomous vehicles operating around San Francisco, apparently for testing, just to see if these vehicles can interact with the environments that they're meant to be in. Little did I know there were about 2,000 level 3 partially autonomous vehicles driving around the city, and you could book a ride in one. You could go to work in one. You could go to a restaurant in one. You could go to a bar. You could go anywhere you wanted to. At some points when we were walking around the city, me, PhD students and research associates, there were more autonomous vehicles than there were conventional cars. And I was amazed. I couldn't believe it. And one of the reasons I was amazed is because some of the research that I'd done up until this point, my view, and I'm giving away the punchline before I give you the results, are that level 3 partially autonomous vehicles are absolutely not safe. And if and when they go wrong, when something happens like an accident or a cyber attack or anything else, human trust will plummet and we won't want to use them. Yet they're being deployed pretty much everywhere. Soon after I left San Francisco, maybe a week or 2 afterwards, you may have seen it in the news, but there was a pedestrian knocked over by a conventional car on the road, and then an autonomous vehicle didn't recognize the pedestrian as a human being, clipped onto the pedestrian, dragged them another 12 meters down the road, and then eventually that person died. They may have been dead already, who knows. A couple of days after that, maybe a week or two after that, GM's Cruise slashed its entire fleet of robo-taxis by 50%, and the CEO was fired. One incident. How many incidents are there with conventional vehicles every day? In Brazil, in the UK, in America, in Australia, all over the world. Hundreds of thousands of conventional vehicles result in accidents. One autonomous vehicle accident hits the news, that's it. These things are not safe. They're also not very good at dealing with holes in the road. The police get really upset with them when they're driving down the road and they ask them to pull over and they check to see who's driving it and there's nobody there. That's a difficult one. Who do you book? And then we've got incidents like this. Ignore the make and model of the car, but we do get incidents where these vehicles do crash into barriers, for example, with the autonomous vehicle system switched on. Arguably, it wasn't switched on, and there are all sorts of things that can happen there. So, I remember reading some of these papers in the early stages of my career. I was a PhD student around about this time. But one of the things that struck me was Lisanne Bainbridge famously said in 1983 about the ironies of automation, and said for every upside of automation, and then we're thinking about AI, there'll always be a downside. And we need to think about the consequences when we're designing it. And the consequences could be job losses, for example. Do we think about that when we're designing automation and AI? Maybe not enough. Raja Parasuraman, who I knew quite well, and Riley in 1997 talked about the misuse, disuse, and abuse of automation. And one of the things that can happen there is we over-rely on automation, and then we let our guards down, suspicion becomes quite low, and then things go wrong. Lee and C in 2004 said to design automation for appropriate and not over-reliance. So we don't want to increase people's trust in technology so that they will think it's perfect. We also want people to be a bit skeptical about things. And various other researchers have said the same. Yet, 25, 30, 35, 40 years on, there are continual incidents involving AI smart agents that are churning out really, really horrible stuff on the internet. There are robots that are crushing humans in factory settings because they're going back to their docking stations and don't understand there's a human there. And then we've got autonomous vehicles being involved in incidents. And there are many examples of these. These are just 3 examples. And what happens in these situations is we lose human trust. And if we lose human trust, because these things, they're very, very unfortunate, but accidents do happen. But if we lose human trust in these technologies, there's a chance that we'll abandon them altogether. What we really need is a socio-technical research approach to what we're doing. That's my view. But you don't need to be too scared about the way things are going, because we see lots of movies, like I was highly influenced by like the Terminator films when I was a child, and these human-like robots that are going to take over the world and we're not going to have a chance. When those things kind of do exist. So this is Hiroshi Ishiguro in Osaka University. And for those of you who've not seen it, if you have a look on a search engine and type in Geminoid, Hiroshi has developed over the last 25 years a robot that looks exactly like him. And when I say it looks exactly like him, it looks exactly like him. You touch the skin of Hiroshi's robot, it's warm. It will leave a red mark. It grows hair. It cries. It can give a lecture where I'm sitting 4 rows back, and I thought it was Hiroshi. And it wasn't, because he came in from the back door at the end of the lecture and said, look how good it is. So there are human-like robots out there, but do we really need them? This is a conversation I have with Hiroshi. He's a really, really great guy, but do we really need them? And I think what Hiroshi is showing is we can develop them. We have social robots that are pretty useful for all sorts of settings, for helping young people with autism, with ADHD, with stress, with anxiety, and so on. We have quadruped robot dogs, which used to scare me so much when I saw that Black Mirror episode with those things going around. But we're using those at the moment and in the near future to go and do things like decommission nuclear power plants, like send a robot in to take out the bad stuff so that humans don't have to go in there in the first place. They're using them in Luleå in northern Sweden to take debris off railway tracks so that trains can pass by without humans going into dangerous situations. So they're pretty cool things. We've got soft robots. We've got weak robots. This is a robot, a weak robot. very, very friendly, and more weak robots. So this is really where we're at. And how ready are we for more advanced robots and AI? What do we not understand about humans and technology? Well, we don't really understand how we trust it that well. We don't understand who to blame when things go wrong. So what happens if this thing starts, you know, sort of swearing at you or saying really inappropriate things to you? Who do we blame? Do we blame the company? Do we blame the person who bought it? And then what about acceptance, adoption, and continued use of this technology? And then what about all these other really important aspects like cybersecurity and privacy and various other things? There are so many questions that are being looked at by numerous researchers, but the technology has been developed at such a rapid pace, we can't keep up with the recommendations, and that's a concern. So I'm going to give you some example research findings, so to speak, from some of the research projects I've led and been involved in over the last sort of 10 years or so, really. So these are the more recent ones. And I said earlier on I'd give examples of autonomous vehicles, so driverless cars. So these are just some pictures from the projects that we've had over the last 5 years where we've got large-scale driving simulators. We do a lot of work with people in participatory workshops. So we never design an experiment in this area without asking the potential end users what you actually want. So we look at the literature, we look at the journals, we look at the books, and we take those recommendations. But if we're designing an autonomous vehicle for somebody in their 70s or 80s, we ask them what they want from a dashboard in the vehicle, not assume that we know what they want just because the literature says so. And we do lots of cross-country projects all around the world, most recently with collaborators in Japan and so on. And we've recently been awarded a large amount of money, so about 12 million UK pounds for an artificial intelligence for collective intelligence hub with a smart city design theme in collaboration with 6 other universities in the UK, including, well, Bath, Bristol, Exeter, Glasgow, University College London, and Ulster. These are what autonomous vehicles sort of look like. You may have seen these images in the past. So this is one of the first autonomous vehicle projects I worked on in 2015. So about 10 years ago is where I started doing research in this area. And that was about 10, 15 years after I started doing research on human factors. So I was doing a lot of research at the time on transportation generally, but not autonomous vehicles. And we received funding from Innovate UK, a lot of funding, £5 million for a 3-year project to basically show or demonstrate that we could get an autonomous vehicle like this with a LiDAR sensor and various cameras on it to drive around Bristol city centre in the UK. By the end of the project, Innovate UK were very, very keen for us to have an autonomous vehicle that drives around a very busy city centre. That wasn't going to happen. But we got the funding. We didn't say that. We got the funding and then we did the research and yeah. So we had a large-scale driving simulator which was developed and built for us. This was so exciting for me at the time by Williams Formula 1 Advanced Engineering. So they came in and built the driving simulator. They kitted out with Bristol Robotics Laboratory the vehicle. So that was actually an operational vehicle in Afghanistan and Iraq. It was taking in supplies and bringing out injured troops. And it could navigate those environments very well. But an old Victorian city is a bit tougher to navigate than maybe, you know, sort of like an open terrain environment. Eventually, this project, I'm going to present you with some findings, but it led to the development of, for example, the Ventura Heathrow pod that operates in Heathrow Airport at the moment. So it's pretty cool. Every time I go to Heathrow Airport and I see one of those whizzing around and thinking maybe we contributed a bit to the design of that. But just to give you some examples, I may have to go to my laptop for this. So this is one of the advanced driving simulators that Williams developed with us. So this was back in 2015. So this is a large-scale simulation environment. The vehicle is in autonomous mode. This was manually switched to drive-in mode, and then in other experiments we switched it to manual mode ourselves. And then this is a picture of a very dirty Land Rover Bowler Wildcat vehicle. We could have washed it before we made the video. Operating around a university campus. I spent a lot of time in that vehicle collecting the data, and it's in fully autonomous mode. So it's driving itself around a university campus with students walking out in front of it, staff walking out in front of it, and so on. And we ran lots of experiments over a 3-year period on this. Now for some of the findings. So we were hoping to present our funders with some very, very positive findings. So in one of the first large-scale trials we did, it took 3 or 4 months to do this. It cost about £4,000 per participant, 27 members of staff, safety teams. I wrote the ethics case for this. It was 180 pages long, the biggest ethics proposal I've ever written in my life. And what we did was we just had people, we oriented them to the driving simulator, we oriented them to the autonomous vehicle, and they spent a number of hours throughout the space of a day taking a journey or lots of journeys in the driving simulator and then the vehicle, or they'd start in the vehicle and go to the driving simulator. So a bit of experimental control there. And what we did was we drove them, sorry, it's miles per hour, so 20 miles per hour is about 30 kilometers an hour, so not slow. We took them out in the Wildcat, and they were driven around at 20 miles per hour for a period of time, and then eventually they'd hear a beep, 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 and that meant they were sort of like this. They were ready to retake control. They were looking out the window. They had their feet not on the pedals, but we wanted to measure, first of all, how long did it take them to get their hands back on the steering wheel and their feet on the pedals, and then how long did it take them to drive like they normally do after that. And this hadn't been well defined before then, because handover was defined as just the amount of time it takes you to drive. So what we did was we also got participants to drive at the start of every day like they normally would, so we could baseline every single person because we all drive differently. So what we found was it takes 2.5 seconds for them to get their hands back on the steering wheel and their feet on the pedals. So that doesn't seem like a long time, but imagine 2.5 seconds in the middle of Belo Horizonte. 2.5 seconds without your hands on the steering wheel and your feet on the pedals, what might happen? Imagine then it takes another 10 seconds to actually drive normally. Those 12.5 seconds, it's carnage. We took it up to 50 miles per hour. These are kind of like, you know, sort of almost like freeway, motorway, highway driving conditions. We were only able to test up to 1 minute afterwards because there would be another handover. They didn't get back to driving normally within 1 minute. So at 50 miles per hour, 1 minute on, they were still swerving in and out of lanes, braking, and doing whatever else. And this was after hours and hours and hours and hours of experience with the autonomous vehicle. So our conclusion, it didn't go down very well, was level 3 partially autonomous vehicles are not safe, yet they're being deployed. We did multiple other trials, so we moved around the university campus. We measured trust, or so we thought we were measuring trust. When we had, so we paid students in the room. We'd pay students £50 to walk out in front of the autonomous vehicle. Loads of students volunteered. They said, how much? With £50. They were like, yeah, what do we need to do? Can you step out in front of that futuristic looking car there? We promise it's not going to run you over. Yes. And then they do it, and then they go to the pub and have lots of beer. Nobody got hurt or killed. It did mount the curb once, but yeah, that was a bit of a hairy occasion. And we thought we were measuring trust. So we'd get vehicles to pull out in front of it. We'd get people to walk out in front of it. We'd get people to push buggies, prams with dolls to walk out in front of it. And then after each major event, we'd ask participants, just using a simple subjective trust rating, how much did you trust the autonomous vehicle in making that maneuver? And they'd shout out the answer. So it'd be a number 0 to 10. And we were so surprised because most of the participants were going 8, 9, 10. What? It just like somebody just walked out in front of it, it slammed the brakes on, then it started driving again, and you could see their hearts were bursting out of their chest. They were shaking. Their eyes were doing this, but they were going 8, 9, 10. Okay. So we upped the ante a bit. We had cyclists involved, more pedestrians, and it was really, really fun to watch when you saw these things. And yeah, we thought, right, okay, people do trust these autonomous vehicles. Maybe we've got it wrong. But it was the subjective measures that we were using, and the fact that we had 27 people on the experimental team, and we all sort of looked like scientists. So when we asked them afterwards, what were you basing your measures of trust on? They said, you, and this cool-looking car. And the safety driver that was sitting by the side of them when they were in it, because they knew that it was going to stop no matter what. So were we really measuring their trust in autonomous vehicles? Probably not. We were measuring their trust in the experiments that we were running. So that was quite a worry, but we had some neat findings after that. So I'll move on very, very quickly to another example project. This is where one of those rare occasions these days where you get to sit in a room with maybe 50 other researchers and say, right, with the next project, let's really think about what we want to do with this project. Who are our user groups? Who do we want to test? Why do we need autonomous vehicles? I keep asking myself this all the time. Because back in 2015, I was a really big fan of the idea of a driverless car. Because I had a long commute to work, and I wanted to sit in a driverless car, take me to work, I could do my work in the car, I could go to sleep. But then we said, well, really, and this happens a lot in the world, and we know this, sometimes we design and develop technology and we deploy it because we can, not necessarily because we need it. So we said, right, okay, who would benefit most from these vehicles if they were being deployed? Should we have them in airports? That's quite useful, you know, for people with accessibility issues and so on. But then we realized, well, what about people who can't drive? What about older adults? What about people with mobility issues? What about people with visual impairments, auditory impairments, and so on? And those people who may need to give up driving in the next few years. And some of us will know people who have had to do that, and it's very, very, very scary experience. So we focused on these user groups, and our mission was to not just collect subjective measures of trust within these experiments, but to collect objective. I love collecting data as a human factors scientist, so we used electroencephalogram, EEG head caps. We used eye tracking. We were measuring pupil dilation as a measure of depth of processing. We were measuring facial expression. We had heart sensors in there. Airbus built special seats with sensors everywhere to measure human state monitoring. And within this project, these were level 4, level 5 autonomous vehicles, so they could drive themselves at all times. The findings were far more positive than the previous project in terms of when we oriented people to the technology, and we were able to design. So we actually designed this dashboard for an autonomous vehicle. It's not a vehicle manufacturer, you know, it wasn't endorsed by a vehicle manufacturer. We designed it from scratch with those users in mind, with all the things they wanted in it, as well as some of the human factors principles. And then we tested these people over a 3-year period, and their trust increased and increased and increased and increased and increased. Some of the participants still didn't want to use it at the end of the experiment. So for example, one of our friends of Flourish there, she said, "You're never going to get me one of these. It's pretty cool, but no." Lots of participants did want to use it, and lots of participants said they need it in their lives now. So very, very positive. One of our last trials, we took our final pod out to a retirement village, and we had it running around a retirement village with people taking journeys to go meet their friends, go and collect their groceries, and various other things, and some images there of participants really loving this technology and saying this is very, very cool. But again, we had some participants saying, well, I could get a taxi. What's the difference? So this was a neat project. Then we moved on to another project, and this one was sort of like negative in the sense of what we were trying to do. Formed a collaboration with some brilliant academics in Japan. So some of my very, very good friends and collaborators. We're working on lots of things now. Professor Tatsu Inatani from Kyoto Law School. So he's a professor of technology law. Professor Minoru Usada from Osaka Robotics, who works with Hiroshi Ishiguro. Dr. Hiro Katsanu, who's an anthropologist in Doshisha, and lots of other people. And we had our UK team. And what we were looking at in this project, the negativity part that I talked about, is what happens when autonomous vehicles go wrong, or what happens when things in the environment go wrong, which means autonomous vehicles may need to stop, or they might actually hit a pedestrian, like the San Francisco example. So, as an example, this is one of our typical scenarios with lots of things in driving simulators, and we collected data in the UK and Japan. We ran about 24 experiments in both countries. So this typical example, you start off on your journey, you're in an autonomous vehicle, you're driving down a country road, you come into a town, you come sort of behind a bus, the bus stops to let passengers off, the autonomous vehicle determines that it's safe to go, there's no oncoming traffic, there's pedestrians on the pavement, and it will try and overtake the vehicle. If it's deemed unsafe to do so, because there's oncoming traffic and there's pedestrians, it won't overtake the vehicle. And then so on and so on. And we build this up with the simple hypothesis that trust is going to increase when you experience these successful maneuvers, if you like. And it did. So that was good. At the end of our experiments, or at the end of most of our experiments, we'd have a critical event. And the critical event in this example that I've put on the slide is a pedestrian steps out in front of the park bus, breaking the highway code, the rules of the road, and the autonomous vehicle couldn't detect it because the bus doesn't have sensors on it, and the screen goes blank, there's no goal. The screen goes blank and it says the autonomous vehicle collided with a pedestrian who sustained minor injuries or major injuries and so on. Let's give you some example. Oh no, maybe I've taken them off there. I'll give you some examples of the cybersecurity results. In this situation, trust goes up. Trust goes up. Trust continues to go up. Trust goes up to about 80, 90%. All the objective measures are looking really great. In this situation, trust is like at its peak. and then as soon as something goes wrong, trust hits a floor level. When we ask our participants after this event, would you ever use an autonomous vehicle in real life? You'll be surprised to know that they said, no, never. If this can occur, I will never get in an autonomous vehicle. So if an autonomous vehicle is capable or not capable of stopping in time to collide with a pedestrian, most people say they would never, ever use one. Doomed to fail, really, you would have thought. But if it's operating optimally, like we see in lots of other research areas, it kind of looks like maybe it will be fine. We've put robots in the cars. We've built dashboards that give feedback to participants to try and say what happened, why it happened, reassurance, apologies, explainable artificial intelligence, and so on. None of these things really have a major effect. Trust plummets and it stays very, very low. So I'm going to move on to some cybersecurity examples. How am I doing for time? Am I okay? Yeah, good. Thank you. So some cybersecurity examples. I'm going to go back to the autonomous vehicle use case because I thought it was better to do that because hopefully everybody's in the mindset of autonomous vehicles. But we do a lot of cybersecurity research in my groups at Cardiff. So for example, people might recognize it. This is SOS Alarm Emergency Control Centers in Sweden. So this is where if you ring the emergency services, you get the fire service to come out, the police to come out, ambulances. We've done cybersecurity research there where essentially our research led to the redesign of the entire computer systems in SOS Alarm in Sweden. We do lots of work with Airbus. I'll come on to some of that later on. And various other things like smart home technology, for example. But I'll come back to the autonomous vehicle use case because I like using the autonomous vehicles as a use case because it's safety critical. It's a technology that most people don't know much about. And it's a technology that most of us have never used. I mean, just out of interest, how many people have ever taken a journey in an autonomous vehicle? How many people have been driven by a driverless car? Just me. Yeah, these are coming. They're coming. If you go to San Francisco, there's loads of them. If you come to the UK in the next 2 years, there's going to be loads of them. They're coming, and most of us haven't experienced a journey in one. Does that frighten you? Maybe it excites you. You think this is really, because it kind of excites me as well. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. So most of us haven't used them. So then we think about these other hypothetical scary situations. So one of my PhD students, Victoria Marcinkovic, she's writing up her thesis at the moment. She's got about a week and a half left to finish it. So if she's watching this on YouTube, she will get it finished soon. She's done some wonderful experiments. She's conducted about 14 experiments in the UK and Japan on what happens in the event of a cyber attack on an autonomous vehicle. What happens to us in terms of our trust? So you're taking a journey in an autonomous vehicle, like I described previously, everything's going fine and dandy, everything's good. And then all of a sudden, beep, 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 all the dials are going crazy and you've been cyber attacked. And the reason this is really important is because I can guarantee you, and I'm saying this on this stage and I'm saying it with the talk being recorded, autonomous vehicles will be cyber attacked. They 100% will be cyber attacked. And the critical national infrastructure that they're connected to will be cyber attacked. It's going to happen. Like with anything else, it's going to happen. So maybe the technology can be prepared for it and we can deal with things. We've got some of the best, cybersecurity researchers out there, but are we prepared for it as humans? Imagine being in an aircraft. You're having a flight, you're having a glass of red wine, nice flight, and then the pilot says, sorry folks, we've just been cyber attacked. The dials are going all over the place. I don't know where we're going in a different direction. You might be a bit scared. But imagine being in an autonomous vehicle doing 50, 60, 70 kilometers an hour and that happens. Kind of a similar situation. So what happens if we prepare people for a cyber attack? So we say to them, right, this is a vehicle. There's all sorts of things it can do. These are the mechanical elements. These are the fuel elements. Like when you get on a plane and you read the safety card. And it says on there somewhere that there is a risk that this vehicle could be cyber attacked. You go, okay. And it says the company that are operating this autonomous vehicle, they've got a high cybersecurity rating. So they've done everything they can to make sure that this vehicle's safe. Then we've got a medium rating, and then we've got a low rating. But all the autonomous vehicles in these experiments, they're operating at the minimal level of legal requirement. It's just these companies have gone a bit above and beyond. And then the type of response after the cyber attack, is it a positive response in terms of the companies looking into this, we're dealing with this, we're going to take you to a safe place, etc., or it's negative in terms of, this is glossing over the actual details of the experiment, but it's negative. What we tend to find, like in the previous experiments, I don't need to go through all of these results, is trust goes up, trust goes down, these are different events. But in the event of a cyber attack, trust basically collapses in the autonomous vehicles. It's gone. And in the high preparedness condition, it's even worse. So when you were really, really prepared for the cyber attack to occur, and it occurred, that's where trust is at its lowest. So we were sort of wondering when we got the results of this, it was quite worrying, and we thought, hang on a minute, what's going on? So at the start of the experiment, it was really, really not lucky that Victoria did this, but it was a great part of the experiment. We thought, right, let's get participants to rate what's important to them about an autonomous vehicle when they get in one. And they rated all the typical things that we might rate when we buy a conventional car, like safety, reliability, practicality, environmental friendliness. And we found that cyber, according to our participants, was the lowest, most important thing to them. And it was like, well, that's a bit odd. So design is more important than cyber. Environmental friendliness is more important than cyber. I get that. Performance, comfort. It was right at the bottom. So luckily, like we sometimes do in psychology, not all the time, we asked our participants at the end of the experiment what they thought. And basically, when we asked them about cybersecurity, they didn't really know what cybersecurity meant. What they thought cybersecurity meant was, oh, maybe the infotainment system, the music system could be compromised. And then I won't be able to listen to my favorite song. They didn't think that the actual vehicle could be compromised and could drive them into a wall or something like that. So we were like, okay, this is a major problem. So nice solution to that was when we provided definitions of what we mean by cybersecurity. So the vehicle could be attacked in this way, this might happen, blah, 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 blah. Cyber went up to almost 4th position. Not only did it go up to 4th position, but I've got all these stars everywhere. Everything that we expected to happen happened. So preparedness, if you were prepared for the cyber attack, so the briefing that you had at the start of the experiment said that this could happen, and this is what's going to happen in the event of a cyber attack, trust was highest, significantly so, in that condition compared to where you weren't fully prepared. Upfront trust in the company was highest, the response to the vehicle was highest, and the best result we had was an interaction where if you had high preparedness and a positive response, that was where trust was the highest at the end of a cyber attack. So if we're ready for it, if we're prepared for it, and the vehicle performs in the way we expect it to perform, trust can actually be restored, for want of a better word. And we've conducted lots of experiments since then. We've conducted the same experiments in Japan. We've created our own briefing cards, videos, simulations, training videos. We've got papers under review at the moment. And it's a really kind of positive sign that maybe part of the issue that we have with these technologies and measuring trust and so on is in the definition, like the devil's in the detail, if you like. And these are some of the recommendations that we're not only making to autonomous vehicle companies, but we're also making them to legislators. So this was me with some of my colleagues and some folks I didn't know. So that's Tatsu and that's Minoru in an Agile Governance Symposium in Tokyo and Kyoto, April this year, where we were talking about, like this event, all sorts of different perspectives on technology and how we drive it forward and how we should have Agile governance, legislation frameworks and so on. So I'm going to round off quite soon. One of the things I wanted to mention, there's far too many words on this slide, I need to change this, is that I did mention at the start of the talk that we've come up with a theoretical framework for how we go about designing human-centered, ethical, assured, responsible, and secure design technology, next-generation AI, next-generation automation, robotics, and so on. And because of my interactions with folks across the world, and one of the reasons why I love traveling and coming to meet other academics and industry experts and legal experts and so on, is because you don't get many opportunities to combine a theory that's developed in Japan with a framework that's developed in the UK to come up with something that might actually drive better design, more optimal, human-centered design of technology forward. So we've come up with a theory that is about predictive coding, where we learn from experience, which is quite a classic thing in psychology. It's been around for 100 years. Where our brains are sort of wired to predict short-term sensory information, and if the real world differs from our internal representation, things go wrong. There's an impasse and things fall down. I won't go into the rest of the details, but essentially the HERES framework presents the principles for how to design a human-centered, ethical, assured, responsible, and secure technology. And the CPCH theory explains why that will work. I'm going to round off before my takeaways just by giving a plug to the Artificial Intelligence for Collective Intelligence Research Hub that I'm very, very proud to be part of. So with this funding framework, we put in a funding bid in early 2023. 106 applications went in the UK. It was hugely competitive. We thought we had a great bid, but like most of us think, we're never going to get it. And we did. We were one of the funded hubs in the UK, one of 9. £100 million worth of investment into AI technology. And basically, this is what we're focusing on. So I'm just going to highlight, these are all my wonderful collaborators. It's led by Seth Bullock, who's an amazing computer scientist in Bristol and a very, very good friend. So we're looking at AI for smart city design. So smart cities, including the traffic environments. AI for pandemic resilience, in collaboration, for example, with Pfizer, with the Cabinet Office, with the NHS. AI for environmental intelligence, AI for healthcare ecosystems, and AI for financial stability, or maybe as we like to refer to it, financial instability. With Professor Laura Smith in the University of Bath, we lead the human-centered design theme, and we're applying all these principles to this project. The design of AI smart agents and things for all of these environments using that HERES framework and the CPCH framework. And we've also got infrastructure and governance as a cross-cutting theme in the University of Ulster as well. And so we had £12 million worth of funding. We've got about 54 partners on board, and they provided over £16 million in funding and contribution in kind. So this is a really exciting project. There are about 50 of us on one research project, which is really nice, including our research associates and PhD students. And just to kind of highlight again that we're adopting this approach of, if we're going to accept technology, new technology, if we're going to adopt it, and we're going to continue to use it, we need to understand trust. We need to understand things like affordances, accessibility, one size is not going to fit all, cybersecurity, privacy, and so on. We need to do the whole lot. We can't just look at one thing and hope that that technology is going to flourish, because it probably won't. Flourish, fail, or perish. That's what I often say to people who are developing some of these new technologies. And just before my last takeaway slide, I wanted to mention that as well as the cybersecurity work we do in relation to the design of technology, so the design of interfaces and so on, we're also very interested in understanding why we, human beings, are cyber vulnerable. I really, really, really don't like it, and I'm guessing most of you won't as well, where we're told the reason that we're so cyber vulnerable is because we're humans and we're stupid. We're really irrational. We just take risks. We shouldn't be allowed to touch the technology in the first place. It would be better if it wasn't for us. Take the humans away from the technology and then we won't have cyber issues. Well, that's not going to happen. So with Airbus support, which I've had lots of support, about £8 million worth of funding over about 5 or 6 years. I've actually spent, as secondment, I spent 4 days a week working in Airbus for 3 years, and I'm still seconded on a shorter-term basis. We started to look at a number of the factors that might feed into cybersecurity vulnerabilities within a large-scale organization with 132,000 employees. And we've come up with a model and a tool that can explain up to 64% of the reasons why people engage in cyber risky behaviors. The tool that comes closest to that, I won't mention what it is, but it can explain about 30% of the reasons why we engage in cyber risky behaviors. So this is one of the most powerful tools out there. But it wouldn't have been possible without so much funding from Airbus to develop it, test it, keep testing it, validate it, and so on. And we know that these are the other factors that account for the remaining variance. So working under time pressure, high cognitive load, being interrupted when we're working, being distracted when we're working, having to task switch all the time. So we're starting to investigate these to get that up, and we're developing interventions to then allow employees to become less cyber vulnerable, such that maybe when you start a job in the future, it sounds quite scary now, but when you start a job in the future, much like you get kind of, fitted to your chair and your armrests and your screen, you'll undergo a cybersecurity vulnerability test as well. And that's not to like whittle you out and say you should be fired. It's to find out how your organization can better support you to be cyber safe. So some key takeaways. The chances are we're not heading for a next generation AI and robot catastrophe for now. But if we keep going the way we are, like Lizaine Bainbridge and Raja Parasuraman and others said, we will end up there. Multidisciplinary, socio-technical, human-centered design and testing is key. Trust, ethics, responsible design and assurance are vital. The HERES and CPCH, I'm a bit biased, but the platform is there to optimize the design, deployment and legislation of next-gen AI. I'm waiting maybe 10 days from now to hear about a new potentially funded grant. So we're through to the last stages. If we get that grant, we're really going to test this again with our collaborators in Japan. And that would be funded by EPSRC and the Japan Science Technology Agency. Autonomous vehicles, I often get referred to as the autonomous vehicle guy. I'm the driverless car guy. I'm not the biggest fan, as you can tell. But it's a really, really useful use case, and I do hope they flourish. I really do hope they do. But we need to get it right. But we also do this work within critical national infrastructure, defense, healthcare, and so on. That was just one example. We're doing research on smart AI agents. There's so much more left to do. Cybersecurity, we may not be doomed. We know what our vulnerabilities are. We know what our cognitive biases are. So let's fight back. And legislation must be informed by human-centered science. So for example, AI, AV, cyber, robotics acts, and so on. And we can see that coming through in some of these acts, which is really, really great. So thank you very much for listening and again for inviting me. And I think I'm going to sit down and join the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for such an interesting talk, for bringing your work from Cardiff to Brazil. Before we get to the debate, I'll hand over to Laura, who is a representative of Britain here.
Obrigada. Boa tarde, pessoal. Congratulations, Professor. Really nice to hear your speech and also your lecture. Learned a lot about autonomous vehicles. I didn't know much about this. Pessoal, para quem não me conhece, não sei se todo mundo me vendo aí atrás, mas eu sou Laura Queiroz, sou a cônsul do Reino Unido aqui em Minas Gerais. Sou mineira, sou daqui de Belo Horizonte, mas estou no consulado já tem 8 anos. Formada aqui no Cefet de Minas, sou engenheira ambiental. Nada a ver, né? Mas estou no consulado atuando na nossa frente principal, que é a mineração responsável. O consulado existe aqui em Minas dentro das representações diplomáticas, principalmente com esse foco de trabalhar com a mineração responsável, o desenvolvimento da mineração responsável aqui no Estado. Mas o governo britânico tem uma atuação bem ampla aqui no Brasil como um todo, né? A gente tem a nossa embaixada em Brasília, temos o consulado-geral no Rio, o consulado-geral em São Paulo, um consulado satélite aqui em Belo Horizonte e um consulado satélite também em Recife, que olha por todo o Nordeste. E esse ano é um ano muito especial para a gente, porque a gente celebra 200 anos de relações diplomáticas entre o Brasil e o Reino Unido. Vários países, né, estão comemorando esse ano relações diplomáticas com o Brasil, por conta de 1825, da Declaração da Independência também, e o reconhecimento da independência a partir de 1825. Mas mais especial aqui em Minas Gerais, porque a gente celebra 10 anos do consulado britânico aqui em Belo Horizonte. Então, a gente atua não somente na mineração, a gente atua em várias frentes e tentando ainda trazer um pouco mais para perto de vocês, a pesquisa é, com certeza, uma das frentes que a gente tem maior orgulho de apoiar. Minas Gerais, eu sou bairrista, mas eu reconheço muito, e o consulado também reconhece muito o papel da UFMG e de todo o ecossistema de pesquisa mineiro dentro do contexto nacional e internacional. Então, a gente tem vários projetos em atuação em conjunto com várias instituições aqui em Minas Gerais, em várias áreas, na parte de infraestrutura, mineração, agricultura, mas também muito focado na parte de tecnologia. Então, a gente tem um time específico, voltado especificamente para essa parte de educação, mas também temos um time específico focado nessa parte de pesquisa e desenvolvimento e ciências. Então, eu tenho muito orgulho de estar aqui hoje, acompanhada do professor Philip Morgan, com sua apresentação. É uma das representações de tudo que o Reino Unido tem na sua expertise acadêmica. Então, a mensagem principal que eu queria passar aqui para vocês hoje, contem com a gente para poder encontrar essas pontes com o Reino Unido. Então, se vocês têm algum projeto, algum interesse específico em alguma área que vocês acreditam que o Reino Unido tem essa expertise, procurem a gente no consulado. Nós ficamos ali na Savassi, na Fernando Estourinho, com Bahia, mas depois eu posso deixar meu telefone, meu contato aqui com vocês também, meu e-mail. A gente está à disposição para poder fazer essa ponte. E esse é o nosso trabalho aqui em Minas, é fazer essas pontes. Então, eu queria parabenizar novamente pela organização desse evento, pelo convite. Estou me sentindo muito honrada de estar aqui hoje com vocês e espero poder contribuir de alguma forma para esse debate também. Tá bom? Muito obrigada.
Well, thank you, Laura. Professor, your work really interacts with our research here at Philotech because we're just starting to study regulation, and I myself finished my PhD thesis August 2024, and it was about design. And I'd argue that if we take the perspective of design, which is beyond physical appearances or how we perceive things, it will be way up high in your survey. And I think when we discuss trust, we're really discussing adherence to norms. When we discuss blame, we're discussing responsibility. And I think we have a great debate ahead of us. Now I'm going to hand over to Professor Maria, who will be giving her thoughts based on what you've really put us to. You gave us a lot to think about, and Professor Maria will be sharing her thoughts with us.
Obrigada, Lucas. Boa tarde a todas, a todos. Antes de falar um pouquinho com o professor, eu queria só fazer aqui rapidamente uma retrospectiva do nosso contato. Eu passei um período em Cardiff, eu já o conhecia, o trabalho dele, e ele me recebeu lá. E muito gentil, como vocês podem ver, né, muito acessível. Eu convidei, ele falou, eu já estive na China, no Japão, Holanda, Estados Unidos, Canadá, e nunca estive no Brasil. Eu falei, professor, o senhor vai ao Brasil. Isso era junho, e ele está aqui agora. Então, é uma alegria muito grande, né, poder trazer um colega, né, uma autoridade altamente qualificada de outro país, para estar aqui discutindo tecnologia com a gente. Não só para estarmos lá, porque o laboratório dele, o Arms, é absolutamente incrível, nunca vi nada igual. É um laboratório multifuncional, multipesquisa, porque tem desde cientistas da computação sob a liderança dele, até criminólogos e antropólogos e tal. E ele é um professor da área de humanas. Então, enquanto no Brasil a gente tem essa ideia de que quem conduz, quem deve coordenar, né, professor Márcio, é a turma high-tech, os techs, lá não. Eu vi claramente que ele era o coordenador eleito para poder conduzir toda aquela turma, era uma turma gigante, sendo da área de psicologia. E eu acho que isso para nós é uma lição, porque às vezes quem é da área de humanas não se sente à vontade para poder ir lá estudar. Ele é um especialista em computação cognitiva, em psicologia cognitiva, e acho que eu queria trazer ele no Brasil agora, a nossa pesquisa, minha e do Lucas, também o professor Fabrício, que é um parceiro constante. As nossas pesquisas em inteligência artificial, elas têm desenvolvido bastante, e eu acho que está na hora da gente estabelecer pontes com esse perfil, com esse recorte de pessoas que são da área de humanas, mas conhecem o suficiente para poder conduzir bons projetos. Então, eu espero que vocês, que a gente possa conversar com ele muitas vezes aqui no futuro próximo. Tá? Muito obrigada. Professor, thank you so much. I'm so glad you are here with us, but I have a ask, and you know, yes, how is it? When we were in Cardiff at the Irons, you spoke about, you talk about one theme, and I was surprised because I never thought about this perspective. You said me, Maria, if we want to think in ethics, in AI, we must study holismos, holistic perspective. And I was surprised because I never studied holistic. Holistic for me is something like Zen or pantheism in Hegel, for example, or mysticism. And I never considered this perspective. And I'd like here listening about this, because for me, it's absolute surprise. And I think that this subject, maybe, it's the next level of philosophy of technology. And I thought this in Cardiff, oh my God, why I couldn't think about holismos. I don't know, holistic perspective. I love this. Thank you very much. And I'm so glad to Rachel, you are here with us. You're so cute. And come back to Brazil, Belo Horizonte, Court of Counts or Court Auditors. Yes, and this Court of Counts and our home, UFMG, our university. It's my heart and our heart. It's in this point, or are in this point. Thank you so much. Come back to Brazil many times. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm quite speechless. I'm not the most emotional person in the world, but when we met in Cardiff a number of months ago, we had a very deep discussion about the future of technology and technology development, and then technology legislation, and all these kind of things. And I've been lucky enough to work with so many multidisciplinary academics, industrialists, government, etc., throughout my career. So I've got a very broad perspective, I guess, on technology. So people say to me in psychology, what psychology approach do you take? Well, I'm a cognitive scientist and I do human factors research, but I don't really take a particular approach. I take the approach that works best for the development and the design of the technology. So one of the things that we were talking about in Cardiff is this idea of holistic versus analytical thinking styles. And the only reason that I started thinking about analytic and holistic thinking styles is because of collaboration with my friends in Japan. So when I started to visit Japan in 2017-18, we had some very deep discussions about how do we make technology work across our different societies. And it was amazing to find, not surprising, but amazing to find that, like, for example, citizens in Japan, they think about trust and blame in technology in a different way to folks in the UK and folks in the US, for example, and most likely folks in Brazil, in terms of their perspective on technology. So one of the things we do in the UK, and I think we're world infamous for this in the UK, is when something goes wrong, we like to blame somebody immediately. So if there's a car accident, we'll say that person pulled out in front of me, it was their fault. It's not because I was driving a bit too fast or because it was somebody else's fault. And we take this kind of analytical kind of thinking style of we need to be able to assign blame now. So we assign blame, we call the police officer comes along, we say it was that person's fault, without really thinking of all the different elements that led up to that situation. And when I was talking to some of my collaborators who are now very good friends in Japan, they said in Japan it's quite different. We think about the situations that led to that, the environmental conditions, the state of the vehicle. Did the person know what the highway code was when they walked out in front of the vehicle, and all these different things. And I didn't really talk about blame that much during my talk. I focused on trust a lot. But when we look at the blame findings, the trust findings between the UK and Japan are very similar. The folks in Japan are less trusting of the technology than folks in the UK, which I was really surprised by, because Japan is a very technologically driven country, but maybe a bit more cautious. But the blame findings were absolutely fascinating, because the blame assignment in the event of a piece of technology going wrong in Japan is very different to that in the UK. All different bits of evidence being collated. So, for example, there was one. There's a bunch of experiments that I didn't talk about there. But one example of experiments that we've conducted recently, and we've submitted a couple of papers, manuscripts on this, are should AI be allowed to break the law? Should automation be allowed to break the law if, in the situation where it breaks the law, it is actually saving your life, or is saving the person in front of you's life who might be walking out in front of the autonomous vehicle, for example? And one of the things we found, and I thought was absolutely fascinating, is if, again, an autonomous vehicle is driving down a road and a person steps out in front of it and it can't stop, we are happy in the UK and Japan and probably all around the world for that autonomous vehicle, if it's safe to do so, to swerve, cross the broken white lines, which is legal to do, as long as there's no consequence of that in terms of colliding with something in the other lane. So of course we're going to do that. We want to save the person. However, if the autonomous vehicle crosses the double white line, which is breaking the law, we would rather hit the person. Now, how many of us would do that when we're driving a car? We would swerve across the broken white line and we save the person if it's safe to do so. But we don't want AI to break the law, and that kind of makes a lot of sense. Why would we want AI to break the law? Why would we want automation to break the law? Because what's it going to do next? But then thinking about this holistic and analytic, and I'll sort of end on this, the analytic, holistic thinking style. Imagine what happens when the autonomous vehicle is driving down the road, a person steps out in front of it, it swerves, it avoids the person, but then it collides with a car reversing out of a driveway. Who's to blame then? And what we find is there's very different findings between the UK and Japan. So we've saved party A, but we've just possibly killed party B. Should the AI, should the autonomous system have been allowed to do that? Within the, just to give you an example, in the UK, none of our participants were happy with that happening. They would rather the autonomous vehicle collided with the person. Whereas the folks in Japan have taken a more holistic approach on that and say, well, we need this evidence, and this like maybe add it up and come up with a value and assign that value. So that's what that's where we're moving into now, the territory of under which conditions should these technologies be allowed to take a discretionary action, if you like we would as a human. And it's very difficult because it's going to be very hard to rewrite the highway code, the rules of the road around the world for the integration of these vehicles, but it's something that we need to consider. So that's one thing we're thinking about when it comes to analytic, holistic thinking styles, and that applies to other things as well.
Então, obrigado. Antes de travar esse diálogo com o professor Philip Morgan, eu gostaria de observar que esse trabalho tão central que a professora Mariá tem feito para trazer a filosofia da tecnologia como centro de debate para o direito e inteligência artificial provocou na Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, especialmente na Faculdade de Direito, uma enorme transformação, né? E da perspectiva do jurista, o diálogo com essas múltiplas disciplinas das áreas de humanas e sociais é mais do que necessário, e hoje a Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais avança mais passos para que esses temas sejam debatidos. E a posição, justamente na Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, como uma das mais importantes universidades de pesquisa, porque ela é uma universidade, dentro da classificação das universidades britânicas, uma universidade real, né? A Real Research University. Essa é a definição que se aplica para a Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, no ranking das universidades no Reino Unido, em especial esse ponto. E eu vou justamente propor ao professor esse diálogo também entre o direito e o centro da Universidade de Cardiff, nessa linha, aproveitando um espaço privilegiado, aberto pela professora Mariá, pela professora Jamile, do Centro de Excelência Monnet, que de longe é um dos projetos mais importantes de internacionalização da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, né? Fazendo esse registro aqui. E agora I turn to English, so thank you so much. Well, it was a very happy opportunity to have you here, and also to learn from your experience in research, and also this transnational collaborations with several universities within the framework of your research. And I would like to remind that in University of Minas Gerais, we had the first grant from the British Academy, and I was glad to be one of the co-researchers with colleagues at the University of Kent. Kent was our partner university in terms of applying for multiple research funds in the past, and we had the possibility to congregate several universities across the region, especially here in Latin America. And also the leadership of University of Kent and University of Minas Gerais led to the first mark of this research grant, which was able to fund our international research mobility and also activities in this framework. It was a very important, I would say, output in terms of research involvement of the university. And also to being rewarded by the British Academy was very important, because it was the first British Academy fund for a law school in Brazil. So it's something that cannot be overstated. It's very important to be said here, and the time that we had many people involved in research between 2015 and 2018. So 3 years of constant, and still today those groups are active, and we had this first, I would say, experiment working together with law schools and political science, international relations, economy. It was a very pool of universities and people working in a very common topic of research, which was law and regulation and in inclusionary practices in terms of social, finance, digital. And so in the end of the project, we assumed that we were not talking about digital inclusionary practice, but rather exclusionary practices related to the use of technology. So exclusion, vulnerability, those issues were also covered by this topic. And today, the research agenda in a human-centered approach of artificial intelligence has to deal with vulnerability to all these externalities that are promoted and generated by the use and abuse of technologies, as remarking that piece of paper that was very important, unintended consequences when we are talking. And just to finish, and also to ask you whether you think would be a very moment and an occasion for establishing such dialogues with law, especially in Latin America, in Brazil. And I would give a very important indicator, which is based the fact that Brazil is the third largest digital community worldwide, and it's ranked the second native digital community, where young generation of people had access, grown up with smartphones, social networks, and now are being introduced to the use of artificial intelligence in daily life, which is something very important. And I think this research agenda with law, psychology, politics, economy, and also more important, computer science has to do and deal with such challenges, and not only focus on the technicalities of artificial intelligence, but rather all these development and further topics which are related to that. And just to focus on this particular opportunity that we have in terms. And Cardiff is also the first, I count my indicators here, I like having this, is the first university, Welsh university from Wales, being partner of UFMG in a exchange agreement, which is 2028 expiring. So we still have time to, deep the potential collaboration in several areas, or even in law, in your fantastic center, research center. And also to give you this important also information that the European, the United Kingdom's universities are targeted by University of Minas Gerais for years. And then we had 18 partner institutions also collaborating. And in law, I'm very proud to have this previous experiences, marvelous experiences, I would say, with so brilliant, so human, so horizontal colleagues, because this is very important in academic relations, that we don't have the same sometimes in France, in Portugal. They are very vertical, hierarchical, and they still think that in general the universities in Brazil are simply a continuation of what they had before, and they sometimes they overstate this importance and historical aspects of the development, independence of our university and research agenda as well. So we had different research agendas in law and technology than Europe has, or United States have, or even Japan have, and South Korea. And basically today I'm really glad that we are unfolding such opportunities and areas where those topics are. So just to have some of your insights on this particular avenues for cooperation in this area, and I would mention cybersecurity, safety in terms of use of AI. Those things are simply disregarded when, for example, the judiciary in Brazil establishes guidelines for the use of artificial intelligence with the courts, and they don't even interact with academics. They simply institute a committee for that, the judiciary in Brazil, and they don't have this, they have the opportunity in hands, but sometimes they just focus on the simple application within the framework of the processes, the judicial processes before the courts, and they don't give a step further toward the implementation of such guidelines in discussing those very technical, important, and also human-centered aspects involving the use of artificial intelligence by the courts, by the judges. So there are so many options and alternatives for research in this area, and I'm sure that this encounter wouldn't be happier than this before. So you can notice my blend of my English accent, because I had previously the training in the United Kingdom, were also to be prepared to lead with Professor Tony Williams, which she's now in University of Cambridge. She's almost retired, but she learned me a lot, because she was this great, magnificent dean, researcher. She was dean of the law school, which had many, she told me, I'm time consumed by the administrative and management issues of the law school, but she opened so gladly the doors, the windows, everything for us, and also we did the same, because we are very reciprocal in terms of this generosity that the universities in general offers, particularly in those kind of relations. I'm glad to be part of this 200 years of collaboration with the United Kingdom as well, as we did with Germany, with Spain, with also countries here, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and also Asia now more and more. UFMG is opening several. I've been to Tokyo before, and also South Korea, Seoul last 3 months ago. So it was also amazing opportunity to be with colleagues there, academics, and so. So basically, I would thought about what we could do in this direction, and what are the avenues for this cooperation. Thank you so much.
I echo every single point you make. So by nature, I've always been collaborative, and I'm gonna rewind maybe 22, 23 years ago when I was just finishing my PhD, and I'm not sort of pointing a finger at people, but I was talking to a bunch of really great computer scientists and really great engineers in my university, and I said, we need to work with each other to generate the best solutions to the problems we have with technology. And some of these folks, we may have been sharing a beer and a wine at the time. They said, no. They said, Phil, you're a psychologist. We can design the technology at pace. You need to better train the humans to get used to it. And we sat there and we had this really open debate, and it was so we're going to keep advancing the technology. Surely it's your job as a psychologist and your colleagues to just get the humans to learn how to use it better. And then I'll fast forward, maybe to 2022, 2023, We've got all these technologies that are being developed, like you said, like, for example, without cybersecurity in mind, and this is happening. 90 to 95% of all successful cyber breaches are because of us, because we let them in. 99% of all cyber attacks are created by humans. 1% is created by AI, and that's going to get bigger. So there are humans creating the cyber attack methods, and we are on the receiving end of it as humans, and we're vulnerable, yet it's not being considered in lots of frameworks and so on. So this multidisciplinary approach is vital, and there are very few research projects that I work on that I'm not working with engineers, computer scientists, lawyers, sociologists, anthropologists, and so on, because we can't solve all of these problems as one discipline. It's impossible. How can we inform legislation if like somebody like me, for example, doesn't work with experts in law and doesn't understand even the basics? So it's really important, but then going to the next level, what I realized maybe 10 years ago when I had the opportunity to do it through funding, and through funding frameworks largely in the UK, really, really amazing frameworks in Europe, mainland Europe and so on. There are these wonderful opportunities to collaborate across countries and collaborate across the globe. And whenever I see these opportunities appear, so for example, I mentioned, I think when maybe in my last answer or when I was on the stage, we've got a funding bid in at the moment that is looking at next generation AI technologies. We're going to be, if we get the grant, we're going to be looking at social robots in care environments for mental health, early diagnosis of mental health issues, the integration of autonomous vehicles and all these kind of things. But again, this is UKRI, so UKRI research funding via the Engineering Physical EPSRC Funding Council with the Japan Science Technology Agency. So that's absolutely great. But we need to be doing this on a global scale. And we can see that I think a number of the funding bodies throughout the world, they're starting to sort of realize that we can only address these massive global issues if we all work together on it. We can't solve the problems in one country. In one country, it's not going to apply to every other country. So we've got ambitions, and I know we share these ambitions with other colleagues, to have research projects that span the globe. Let's span the globe and let's look at all of these different country and cultural perspectives on the development of technology, the legislation, and let's all sit around the same table and try and solve these problems together. Let's not make it a one country approach or a one continent approach. The global approach is really, really important. So any opportunity to collaborate with universities, industry, government, and so on in Brazil would be absolutely fantastic. In South America, Latin America, absolutely brilliant. We put in a funding bid, I think it was last year, which was an extension of our AI for collective intelligence research project, the one I talked about during the last slides there. And we identified through existing collaborations, collaborators we thought from all around the world. So every continent and so on. But our collaborators, and this was, we're going to slap ourselves on the hand, our collaborators in South America and Latin America, they, for us, and it's our fault, they weren't strong enough. So if we were collaborating with folks like yourselves and folks in the room, we may have got the funding for that bid because we were told that was one of our weaknesses. So let's chat, let's talk, let's come up with ideas, let's sit around tables, come up with grant ideas, let's seek those funding opportunities, and let's speak to the funding providers and say to the funding providers, you know, it doesn't take an awful lot of money to be able to do the kind of research that I've been talking about on the screen there. And I think, yeah, more models where we can have, you know, cross-country, bilateral, etc. Funding opportunities, the better, and then we get to do great research together and talk to the world about it.
Yeah, you pointed at me like the bank now.
I know you know all the.
Yes, but from our perspective, I totally agree with what you said. For us, really important that the two parts, they have already settled a strong project with strong deliverables and real actions. That's what the British government normally really values. So we want to see the result. From our perspective as well, as a Brazilian, I believe that UFMG are really capacitated to have the best projects. And also, I will always try to bring everything to Minas Gerais. So please keep in touch. If you're developing something, talk to me, because it's good. We receive like the bidding process from one day to another, so we need to have the projects in our drawer. So when it appears, we have like 3 days to submit it. It needs to be already done. We stay like, wake up at night writing it down. So it's good for us to be in touch constantly with this project. So when the chance comes, we're able to put our efforts together and build it like in 4 hands, 5, 6 hands. So that's really important for us also to be involved, because when we have the British government stamp, I think it becomes stronger. So we can also show you how this can align with our objectives here in Brazil, how this commit with our mission here in Brazil, so this can make the cases stronger, because the majority of the funding comes from Innovate UK, UKRI. So and Brazil, I know that FAPESP has a really good connection with UKRI. But we could also bring potentially FAPEMIG to it, and we could try to bring like a blended, some blending projects. But we can talk in more details about this in the future, not really far away, near future. Yeah, and I'm glad to know about the, I don't know if it's an MOU that you said that you already have, yeah, with Cardiff. Okay. Yeah. Fantastic.
I'm also, yeah, so the agreement, so we've got 4 international deans across the world. So the dean for South America is amazing. So I think 2028, maybe I shouldn't say this, but it's just a date. So we can talk and we can extend these kind of things and these discussions. Yeah.
They intensified the cooperation with UK institutions so that they could connect with Asia, Latin America, and this was a very important strategic part of the work of the University of Minas Gerais, also expanding. Our colleagues are not here. Professor Aziz, who is the Dean for International Relations of the University of Minas Gerais, but he has been very active in such strong, I would say, cooperation opportunities, and I believe that in the very near soon, I mean, within weeks, we can work in such draft and also discuss this later as well. And that's good that the official, I would say, representation of the government's also here in Minas Gerais, and we are very keen on bringing this for a very official flag in terms of the UK and Minas Gerais collaboration, which is yeah.
And without Red Bull.
Without. Yeah, so people kind of get used to me, and Maria, you may get an email in the future, and it's rather cheesy. I'm not the biggest fan in the world, but when we see a funding opportunity to come out, and it could be, you know, a cross-country funding proposal, I'll email lots of my contacts who I think, you know, we could form a great collaboration on this, and I'll say, let's assemble, and that usually means we need coffee, Red Bull. We're going to be working very hard for the next week, and if I get those replies within maybe 5-6 hours, you know it's going to be a successful bid, because people go, we're in, let's have a call and let's do it. Because the funding, you know, the timelines can be quite short, but if you know the right people and you work with those people, you've got those relationships, you can pretty much make anything happen. You just got to go for it. Yeah.
Outside, quem tem amigo tem tudo. So that's it.
No, Professor Philip, thank you. As we conclude, I'm gonna ask Professor Márcio Luiz, who is our constitutional law professor, and he has been researching digital law with us. He will wrap it up and ask for questions from the audience. Thank you.
Bom, boa tarde a todos. Todas. Eu só gostaria de agradecer, né, a presença de todos aqui, depois eu falo em inglês, de todas. Eu tenho trabalhado com a professora Jamile há mais de 10 anos, na primeira versão do centro. Tenho ficado próximo, às vezes me afasto um pouco por algumas razões de trabalho fora da universidade, mas o Centro Monnet tem congregado estudantes, professores do Brasil, fora do Brasil, e que eu gostaria de agradecer em nome da professora Jamile, que teve que sair. Ela me pediu para que ao final agradecesse a presença de todos. Ela e a professora Carla, que é chefe de departamento. Então, eu estou aqui falando em nome do centro, já que eu sou, acho que, um dos pesquisadores mais antigos do centro, junto com a Jamile. A Jamile é a nossa titular, né, de fato e de direito. Então, é só para agradecê-los nesse primeiro momento, tá? Well, I would like to thank you very much on behalf of Professora Jamile, for all of you who have been here. You came from all over the world. I mean, so many students, so many professors. Professor Jamile, she had told me before she left that I should thank you all for your presence here in the seminar. And that's what I'm doing here, because I have been working with her for so many years, for about 10 years now. And, well, before we end, Professor Morgan, thank you very much. And I have only one question. We have a serious problem of governance. And especially when we talk about artificial intelligence, we have to think about a global governance. And you have such a long way now studying artificial intelligence. And politics and public policies are very difficult, especially when we think about a global governance. And I would like you to tell us a little bit, what are your expectations related to global governance on artificial intelligence, considering that we may have cyber attacks, public and private cyber attacks? So that's only a little thought about that. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Obrigado.
Thank you so much. It really means a lot. I mean, in terms of global governance, it's probably one of the biggest challenges we face, next to the development of the technology in the first place. I mean, one of the slides I presented during my talk was about a new framework that has emerged in Japan that is influencing the G7. So this is being talked about in, around G7 tables, is this idea of agile governance. So there's a new agile governance framework that is very, very strong in Japan. And that's being discussed at the table with G7 countries, and it needs to go wider than that. So it's having this agility to respond to different things. So, like, for example, the cyber landscape is going to evolve. It's going to evolve. It evolves every single day. So there are new things that are happening every single day, new types of cyber attacks, new types of vectors, new AI methods that are coming in, and so on. And how do we deal? How do we deal with that? Can we have legal frameworks, that are meant to be in place for the next 30 years to deal with particular types of cyber attacks? Probably not. It needs to be very, very agile, and it needs to keep up with the advancement of the AI and also us as humans as well. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not a legal expert, and I know it's very, very difficult for these to be developed. But we need things that can be we need things that can respond and change quickly in response to the galloping pace in which these technologies are developing. I mean, just imagine a world. Imagine 2030. What is 2030 going to look like in terms of AI? Where if you asked, like, in 2015, what was 2020 going to look like? A lot of people would have got it wrong. If you talked about things like large language models and so on in 2015, they won't be that good. They won't be able to do that. It's the biggest problem now we've got in universities, that students are generating most of their, not all students, but they're generating most of their assignments through LLMs. Is that bad? In some respects, yes. In other respects, maybe not. But what do we do about that? And what is the world going to look like when it comes to AI in 2030, 2035? And will the current laws and legislation frameworks be able to deal with that? Probably not. So how do we build this agility into it, and how do we do it on a global perspective? Because a lot of these AI technologies, they're not being developed for one country, they're being developed for the entire world. So yeah, it's really important that we all come together to discuss this and get these different perspectives. I understand a bit more about law now than I did 10 years ago, but I'm no legal expert by any stretch of the imagination. But I love sitting around tables and talking to legal experts about their perspectives and everything else, and then understanding what the constraints are and what the opportunities are as well. But yeah, I'm going to use the word agile. I know it's used a lot. It may, it's not necessarily an answer, but it's something that I think we need to think about, systems that can be developed quite rapidly to keep up with the pace of the technological development. Otherwise, like Zane Bainbridge said, and Raja Parasuraman and lots of other people, we're going to be in trouble.
Well, Professor, thank you. Before we have an open floor, we'd like to acknowledge Professor Roberto Novais' presence and ask if you want to ask some questions, make some remarks.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity and for the presentation. And actually, I have a question concerning your findings, your research. You have presented us very concrete examples of technologies that we are used to, that are very familiar to us, such as cars and vehicles. So everybody knows what a car does and what to expect when a car works and when a car fails. So the use of an autonomous technology to drive the car scare us most because we are familiar with that technology. When we are not familiar, so the workings of the technology are hidden from us, maybe we would not be so worried about the failures of that technology. So for instance, in your findings, you have shown us that people did not know what cybersecurity meant, and they were not worried about that. After some explanation, the concern level raised. So it seems to reinforce the idea that ignorance is a bliss. When we are talking about AI agents that are already working in our everyday lives, for instance, evaluating credit risks, evaluating insurance policies, evaluating health insurance, and so forth, we are not aware of that. Does your framework you have presented, so far as I could understand, help us to comprehend and to deal with those technologies that are all around us, but they are hidden from us? So I did not understand thoroughly what the HERE's framework was. Yeah. So if you could develop a little bit more what this framework is, and if it is suitable to deal with those less concrete and less visible technologies, but the technologies that are already interfering with our daily lives. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. I think it's always maybe best to answer a question like your last one with a concrete example. So one of the research projects that I didn't mention was one that was funded by CREST within the UK, which is via the Economic Social Research Council. And what we were looking at there was people's understanding of their own cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And the example, task domain we used there was something that is familiar to lots of people, but we may not be so familiar with the workings of the system. So for example, smart home technology. I guess most people in the room have at least one item of smart home technology. It could be an Alexa system, it could be a smart light bulb, it could be a smart window, it could be a smart whatever, a boiler, whatever you like. So one of the things we looked at was, okay, people have got a very, very good understanding, and we were applying some of these principles to it, of the human-centered design, the assurance levels, the responsible by design, the security by design, elements of a smart light bulb, maybe they read the instructions of a smart boiler, a smart window. But then when we asked participants in an experiment to connect these things together in your home so that they work in like symphony, in harmony without telling them about their cyber security, the secure by design principle, for example, without telling them about security and privacy concerns. We had some really alarming findings from this study. If people were not primed to think about cybersecurity or think about privacy, they connected these systems using IFTTT, if then I can never remember it. They connected them in such a way that they left their homes completely vulnerable. So in such a way that the smart bulbs come on when they should come on, and the smart boiler came on when it should come on, but any cyber criminal with a shred of intellect would be able to know when they're in their homes, when they're not in their homes, how to break in, and do various other things. So through the use of an early iteration of the HERES framework, human-centered design, ethical by design, explainability, some priming for participants in experiments allowed them to think more clearly about how these technologies are designed and how they link together, even though they can't really see it. And the findings were, without going into lots of detail because we won't have the time, that when we had new participants in new experiments, the way they connected their smart home devices were very secure and very, very private. But they needed to be made aware. So we need transparency. We need explainable artificial intelligence, for example. But we shouldn't go too far. So we've got findings from some other experiments that we've run where, for example, using the autonomous vehicle example again, something happens with an autonomous vehicle and then it stops, and we give participants an explanation of what's happened, the what and the why. So basically, the autonomous vehicle was overtaking a bus. The autonomous vehicle could not detect the person in time. The autonomous vehicle collided with the person. The person has sustained minor injuries. The emergency services have been notified. Somebody's going to come to your assistance soon. Trust was lowest in that condition because we were giving participants too much information. There's a fine balance between what we need to tell people and what we don't need to tell people. So just give us kind of like the basic information. Don't start assigning blame, for example, because like in one of those conditions, they were told that the pedestrian violated the highway code. Well, that's like saying it was the pedestrian's fault. What about the manufacturer of the autonomous vehicle, and where are all the sensors to detect this? So yeah, we need to give people enough information, like in the cybersecurity example, so they understand what cybersecurity means in the context of that application domain, so that they can better understand what's going to go on. And I'll end with another example, because I thought these findings were fascinating, and I didn't get time to present this either. We've got another manuscript under review at the moment. So in one of Victoria Marcinkovich's PhD experiments, we had a situation where the autonomous vehicle was cyber attacked. The briefing information participants received were that in the event of a cyber attack, if it occurs, you're going to hear this sound. If it's a mechanical fault, you hear this sound. If it's a weather issue, you'll hear this sound. And what the autonomous vehicle will do is this. So the cyber attack will occur. It will drive at the same speed. It will find a safe place to pull in, and it will stop. If the autonomous vehicle does that in the event of a cyber attack, our trust is barely diminished because it's doing what we expect it to do. It's congruent. If the autonomous vehicle carries on driving, trust is gone. So we need that level of congruency as well, and that's where the HERES framework comes in, the human-centered design, trying to understand what humans think, the affordances, those kind of things, that it's assured and it's secure by design. There are lots more examples I could give, but yeah, probably won't have enough time. But hopefully you'll all read the paper at some point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Acho que a gente já está caminhando para o final. E eu queria deixar um agradecimento muito especial à professora Jamile, que se tornou nossa titular, né, professora titular essa semana. Ela fez questão de colocar a defesa dela no meio, né, desse seminário, que estava todo o clima, né, a vibe para que isso acontecesse. Eu estou muito feliz dela ser a nossa nova catedrática. E agradecer ao Centro Jean Monnet, que nos acolhe, né, com certeza é o projeto, né, de internacionalização, não é professor Fabrício Hardcore hoje na Faculdade de Direito. E a gente só tem a agradecer a nossa musa, a nossa diva do Jean Monnet. E também quero agradecer aos pesquisadores que estão aqui, do Filotec, Mariana, Juliana, Wilson, mais quem? Estão aqui prestigiando. E a gente segue. Tiago, que está lá atrás escondido, que simplesmente é o dono da casa, dono do direito aqui, Está lá sempre muito discreto. Obrigada, viu, Tiago, pelo apoio. Mariana Faria, Isabela, claro, que o professor, a Rachel falou com ela hoje que ela é uma queen, né? Não foi assim? E o professor Morgan falou que a bijuteria dela estava linda, estava muito, muito queen. Muito obrigada. E aí, eu acho que, antes da gente terminar e o professor Lucas fazer o encerramento, gostaríamos de ouvir, claro, né, o dono desta casa, o diretor da Escola de Contas, né, do Tribunal de Contas do Estado de Minas Gerais, que é o professor Dr. Rodrigo Marzano, que está aqui prestigiando até o último minuto. E, realmente, se não fosse pelas mãos dele, né, professor Márcio, professor Fabrício, professor Lucas, talvez nós não tivéssemos conseguido fazer um evento tão grande, sob o ponto de vista mesmo de qualidade do evento, né? Às vezes a gente pensa em quantidade, mas qualidade realmente né, é o que a gente visa. Então, professor Rodrigo Marzano, muito obrigada, e gostaríamos, antes do nosso mediador encerrar, ouvir suas últimas palavras sobre essa parceria, sobre nossa relação no Monnet. Muito obrigada pela oportunidade.
Bom, só agradecer, né, a presença aí de todas e todos, são muito importantes. Essa parceria vem sendo construída com diversos tijolos, né, para construir aí uma casa forte, né? Toda a relação é recíproca. A nossa missão, enquanto escola de governo, é a capacitação contínua dos servidores, né? Então, é nosso interesse a qualidade das formações nessa casa, e estamos construindo com diversas instituições e também muito mais fortemente agora com a Cátedra Monnet, com a Universidade Federal, essa parceria para diversos assuntos. Um deles é debate, seminários, né? É um seminário internacional com tão alta qualidade, mas também para o ano que vem nós vamos ter workshop, especialização, mestrado, pós-doutorado, que vai ser aberta a possibilidade de servidores dessa casa que já se doutoraram estarem fazendo pesquisa na área de controle. A escola já tem 2 especializações, né, que é finanças públicas, que são 2 turmas online, e nós vamos inaugurar agora uma de políticas públicas e controle, já pensando toda uma escala. Os grupos de pesquisa também têm a parceria da Universidade Federal, inclusive com o curso de Ciências do Estado, né, que esse ano nos atendeu com estagiários em toda a casa, né? Então, os últimos períodos aí de Ciências do Estado estão sendo alocados em diversos departamentos aqui do tribunal, realizaram a pesquisa, uma auditoria, na realidade, de grande competência agora nos 853 municípios de Minas Gerais, né? Só 25 municípios de Minas Gerais não responderam à auditoria, que foi formatada com os técnicos do tribunal com auxílio dos estagiários, né? E para o ano que vem a gente pensa na residência, né? E a gente está chamando assim, né, residência rural dos cientistas do Estado. Começamos com um projeto de controle interno que os técnicos do tribunal vão analisar durante um ano 10 municípios, as suas controladorias, né? E todos os desafios e melhorias que possam ser, porventura, implementadas a partir dessa auditoria do tribunal vão ser feitas em loco, com técnicos do tribunal e estagiários do curso de Ciências do Estado, numa parceria inédita no Brasil, né? O conselheiro Durval, que é presidente hoje do tribunal, também é diretor institucional de um grupo que chama Atricom, né? A Associação dos Conselheiros de Conta do país, e ele quer levar esse projeto como um case de sucesso para o Brasil inteiro, da ideia da gente ter uma presença institucional mais forte nos municípios. Então, na realidade, é só dar um abraço aí a todas e a todos, agradecer muito a presença dos professores, a cooperação, né, e, mais do que isso, a reciprocidade, né, o tanto que a gente gosta da Universidade Federal, da Universidade Pública, é o tanto que a Universidade Pública gosta da gente. E nós temos que externalizar isso para os nossos jurisdicionados. Então, agradecer aí a todas e todos.
Well, I think that's it. Thank you so much. I think when we think about everything we've discussed here, after all, we're talking about digital literacy, AI literacy, and we already have a project that's ongoing in our state that we already have dozens of cities who are willing to take our course on AI literacy and digital literacy when we in the public government, and we plan of taking this nationwide. So maybe you can come along with us, and thank you so much for your time and for sharing everything with us. Amanda is also our PhD student that's on the back. She wasn't mentioned before. So we're acknowledging her. That's it. That's a wrap.
Encerramos aqui o segundo Seminário Internacional Governança Corporativa, Comércio e Consumo Sustentável, Experiências da União Europeia e do Mercosul em Perspectiva Comparada. Agradecemos a presença de todos e todas e desejamos que tenham uma boa noite. Muito obrigado.
Agora melhorou 100%.